Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to DCA's Delta Stakeholder Engagement Committee meeting. We're being held via teleconference, Ring Central, on Wednesday, February 24th, 2021. I don't know what happened there. Hang on just a second. I think I touched something. Oh, there it is. Okay, good. At any rate, thank you. I am Chair Sarah Palmer. Thank you for joining us, and we appreciate your taking time to participate in this process, providing your thoughts on ways we can provide a community focus on the engineering aspects of a proposed conveyance project. So could we please have the roll call?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Long time no see. Start with Chair Palmer.
Here.
Vice Chair Keegan.
Here.
Committee Member Swenson. Committee Member Whaley. Committee Member Berrigan Priya. Committee Member Giacomo. Committee Member Glosky.
I'm here.
Committee Member Welch.
Here. On third.
Committee Member Shia. Committee Member Marino.
Here.
Committee Member Cosio.
Here.
Committee Member Gonzalez Potter.
Then we got even two rowdies for the hood.
Committee Member Cox.
Here.
Committee Member Chairman Tarango.
Here.
Committee Member Wallace.
Here.
Committee Member Mann. Committee Member Liebig. Committee Member Lytle.
I'm here.
Committee Member Moran.
Here.
Committee Member Vice Chairwoman Tayaba.
Here.
Committee Member Merlo. Committee Member Hardesty.
Here.
And then let me just go back through the list again on the folks that I missed. Committee Member Swenson.
Yeah.
Committee Member Whaley. Committee Member Berrigan Priya. Committee Member Giacomo.
I'm here. I'm sorry I was muted.
No worries, thanks.
And if Berrigan Perea is here, I'm uncoordinated.
Awesome, thanks guys. I got you both. And then a few more. Committee Member Gonzalez Potter. Committee Member Mann. Committee Member Liebig. And Committee Member Merlo. And that is it. Looks like we have a quorum.
Yes.
I'm
Chair
sorry,
Palmer,
Jasmine.
are you
I'm
on?
here.
Chair Palmer, were you able to get back on? Okay, so Vice Chair Keegan, are you on? It's one of those days where apparently folks are having some
Yes,
issues.
I am on.
Okay, great. Might you have,
Anna, I saw Anna Swenson, I got you. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Vice Chair, do you want to go ahead and do some of those?
Call the meeting to order.
Yes, please.
All right. Welcome everyone. We're waiting for Chair Sarah Palmer to get back on us. We have taken the roll call. Thank you, Jasmine. And at this point, it's the minutes review, December 9th, 2020 regular SEC meeting. Does anyone have any comments or corrections to the meeting minutes?
Yes, I have a comment that I'd like to make. I can't remember how to raise my hand. I'll figure that out in a second.
Sure. Can you identify yourself, please?
This is David Glosky.
Thank you, David. Go ahead.
Yeah, on page 13 of the minutes, I'm not questioning that it might have been transcribed exactly how I said it, but I probably didn't say it very well. And the
Okay,
point I was trying to make in minutes is that I think that if there is a new pumping station put in, if the Bethany alternative goes, I think it should be such that either the existing bank station or the new one could be used with either of the through Delta conveyance or the tunnel, so that they're completely interchangeable. And that was the point I was trying to make, and I probably didn't come out in the minutes very well.
okay. So staff, is it possible we can make that correction as Mr. Dlasky requested to the minutes?
Yes, of course. And then I
Okay.
just wanted to note for the record, Douglas Shia emailed in a couple minor edits as well. So we'll be adapting those to reflect on the minutes.
Okay.
Thank you.
So are there any other comments or corrections on the minutes before we entertain a motion? Okay, seeing none, does anyone would anyone?
I don't think we do a motion.
Oh, we don't, okay, sorry. Okay, so we just acknowledge them. So
Do you want me to, excuse me, I'm sorry, Co-Chair, do you want me to go back over the introductory elements, the housekeeping about reminding folks how to raise their hand and that sort of component?
I can do that now.
well,
I'm back
sure,
on.
and I see that Chair Palmer is back here, so I will turn chairmanship of the meeting back over to Ms. Palmer.
Great.
You're doing a wonderful job. Okay, why don't I go? You want me to go over the housekeeping practices, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so let's go for the practices for the virtual meeting. And this is just a review for all of you, I know, but the SEC discussion process and public comment periods will remain consistent with past meetings. So during the discussion portions of our meeting, SEC members will use the raise hand function. And I know that on the Android, it's down toward the bottom. And when you put on participants, you can raise your hand and you can put your hands down as well. Within Ring Central, and Ms. Martinez will call the name of the SEC member to make a comment or ask a question. As in past meetings, SEC members will have complete control of their video and audio at all times. We request that you keep your videos on to make for a better meeting. It's nice to see everybody's face if at all possible. And we also ask that everyone mute themselves when not talking to eliminate unintended background noise like my dog going crazy. So public comment. With this Ring platform, attendees will be muted. That's not the panelists. The panelists have their option of muting themselves. The attendees will be muted and not have a video option unless they are speaking during a public comment. At that point, we will unmute you, and it will be up to you, the speakers, whether or not you activate your video. If you wish to provide public comment on agenda items, please complete the online public comment form by 4 p.m. The link can be found on the dcdca.org website on the SEC agenda. Once we get to the end of each agendized item in the meeting, our facilitator, Valerie Martinez, will call out to each person to speak. The line will be opened and the speaker will provide comments. We will follow the same process for public comment on non-agendized items. The public may also provide written public comment by email, and that is to public comment, that's all one word, public comment, at dcdca.org. All written comments received prior to the conclusion of the meeting will be included in the written record for the meeting, but we're not going to read them during the meeting, but they will be part of the written record. So now we've done the minutes review. Is that correct?
Yes.
And now we're going to the DCA SEC update. So let's see, updates, yes. As we commence on item 4A, I'll note that there have been some personnel changes on the DCA board as well as on the SEC. On the SEC, I want to publicly recognize Peter Robertson. He's representing our recreational constituency, and he's past president of the Recreational Boaters of California, and he's retired from the SEC. He has some personal reasons for doing so, and so Peter, we just applaud you for all that you've done for us now, and are sorry to see you go. I also want to recognize Sean Worth. He's been representing our environmental community and is a member of Save Our Sandhill Cranes and the Sierra Club. He has also chosen to step down over the last week. And Sean, we are very sorry to see you go because you have provided some really important input and have provided input for potential changes to the Delta Conveyance itself. So you've been a very worthwhile member of this. I want to thank both of you for your service. You've been critical in representing your constituencies and in raising awareness and introducing sensitive issues related to the design and engineering aspects of the conveyance project. We understand that you do not support this project, even though you've contributed wonderfully to this committee. Understand that you do not support the project, but your engagement has helped ensure that if the project is built, it is built with the Delta as place at forefront for all of us. So I think, let's see, Barbara, you have your hand up for something? Co-Chair Keegan?
Yeah. Oh.
I'm sorry if I had it up, it was inadvertently. I thought it was Barbara Berrigan-Perea who had
Yeah.
I do that kind of thing all the time. Okay.
Yeah, I think
I just wanted to give you the heads up that where I'm at, the wind is whipping around the internet service. May go on and off screen if it's low, just so I can stay on. And if I disappear, I will be working to get back on my phone. That's all. Thank you.
Hey, I'm going through the same thing here, Barbara, so I fully understand. Okay.
Barbara,
right.
if we're missing you, just feel free to text me, and I can sort of let everybody know that you're here and trying to speak. Okay.
Great. Okay, so do we have any DCA board members online? Jennifer, do we know? Are there any online, or Jasmine? No. Okay,
I don't believe we do.
Okay. Well, we do have
Sorry, Sarah, Richard Atwater, he just raised his hand. We could.
Oh, okay. President Atwater, would you please introduce yourself and please welcome to the SEC.
Let's see, I think Jennifer, we need to move him over and unmute him real quickly. Just give us a quick moment.
Sorry, okay, so I just moved him over.
Can we
Richard, are you there?
Can we also move over Director Millibar?
Yes, please. So we have two members of the board. Excellent, aside from myself. I did want to mention that now we do have a 7-member board, as you are aware of, and this is very, very useful because now we represent more of California, and we will be able to have more minds working on this thing. So go ahead, President Atwater, if you would, please.
Yes, I was getting word there. I'm welcome to Sarah and all the members of the SEC board. Unfortunately, as you can hear in the background, my next door neighbor has a gardener doing a leaf blower, so I will not talk for long because it's pretty irritating. But I'm listening to the meeting, and hopefully he'll be done in a little bit.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. We really do appreciate that. And then I believe Director Millibar, who is Secretary of the DCA board, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes. Can you hear me okay?
We sure can. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I was very pleased to be on the DCA board, and I'm looking forward to a lot of interaction, and I think this committee that you have is extremely important to our process. I'm very interested in seeing how the meetings are conducted and hearing the discussions, and I'd just like to say thank you for allowing me to attend your meeting.
Thank you very much, Director Millibar. I'm so glad that you could make it here. We do have other members which we'll speak of later in a later presentation. So was that it? Do we have just?
We also have 2 other directors.
Great.
Director Tony Estremera and Gary Martin.
Okay, Director Estremera, would you like to introduce yourself, please? Are you there? Well, I'm glad that he's here. And
Jennifer, have you moved him over?
Yes, he's moved over. Tony, you're muted, so you might have to unmute yourself. Go ahead and try now, Tony.
You can see we all have these problems, folks. And then please also make sure that fourth person is on as well. There's Tony. Okay. Tony, would you like to introduce yourself, please? Okay.
Tony may be having some technical difficulties. He's there, but.
Okay, then who is the other director that is on right now?
Director
Gary
Martin.
Gary Martin. Uh-huh.
Yes.
Great. Director Martin, would you please introduce yourself? Tell us where you're from and just say hello to the folks, please.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. I'm a member of the Santa Clara Valley Water Agency Board of Directors. As a matter of fact, I'm board president right now. I'm very honored to be part of the DCA board and looking forward to my very first SEC committee meeting. I've heard a lot about it. I've read a lot about the valuable input we get, and I'm anxious to hear it and see it in person. So I'm very anxious to be part of the work going forward, and thank you very much.
Great, thank you for being present. Do we have Director Estamera ready for us at all? Tony? Well, he's here, and I think you've all heard from him before, and if he can get the thing going later, we will let him say a word to you, but I'm just very pleased that we have at least 4 of the directors and 5, including myself, present today, and very glad to have your interest in the SEC. Okay, so let's move on. We are now getting into...
We have a Director Estamera on camera and
Yay,
everything.
Director Estamera!
Live and in person.
Hi, sorry I was stepping back here, but always glad to listen to what the community has to say. So thank you, Sarah. Appreciate it.
Okay, Tony, thank you so much.
Great.
So,
and Barbara, too, is out there. Thank you.
okay, so Richard and Martin and Tony and Gary, thank you very much for coming and being at our meeting today to observe what's going on, and welcome. Okay, then let us continue on with, let's see, there, we've got the DCA board members. Hang on, I've got to make sure I follow everything. We're on to item 4A. So this is a discussion about AB 992, which is a
Yes, has Josh made it back on? He was having some technical difficulties. That's the theme today. There you are, Josh.
Yeah, I think I'll take that as my cue. Good afternoon, everyone. First item is an overview of AB 992, which is a recent update to the Brown Act, which took effect on January 1st of this year. Before we dive into the details of the new bill, I wanted to provide a little background and context. As you will remember from I think our first meeting, the Ralph M. Brown Act is the local meeting law that applies to local agencies. And you've seen this slide before in different formatting, but the Brown Act applies to local agencies and their bodies in a whole host of ways. And for our purposes, those first 3 bullet points are relevant. So the first is the Brown Act, of course, applies to local agencies like the DCA. And in particular, it applies to the legislative bodies of those local agencies. And so that while that, of course, includes our board of directors, it also includes any subsidiary advisory committee that our board creates, including like the SEC. And what it does is it regulates, to the 3rd bullet point, meetings of those legislative bodies. And so as a general rule, and absent an exception, anytime a quorum or majority of this body or any other legislative body meets, it needs to be at an open and public meeting like this forum. As you'll remember, we have 20 members on the SEC, and that does not include the ex officios. They're not included for purposes of counting a quorum, although of course we treat them just like other members. For Brown Act purposes, it's the public members and then directors Palmer and Keegan. Next slide, please. Perhaps the most Most common inadvertent issue or problem we run into the Brown Act are what are called serial meetings, or situations where a quorum of a legislative body is discussing agency business outside of a noticed public meeting. That is a violation of the Act. And the way that those can occur is anytime a majority of the body is using communications and intermediary or technology to be discussing agency business outside of a meeting. So in our example, anytime we have 11 members of the SEC using emails, text messages, phone calls, in-person meetings to discuss SEC business outside of one of these meetings, we'd have a Brown Act violation. I think one of the good news for us is, given the size of our body, it's difficult to reach that threshold, and I do appreciate everyone's work so far through this process. It just really hasn't been an issue to date. In particular on that, one area we run into particular problems is on emails. So, you know, for emails, if someone were to send an email to the entire SEC, and then SEC members start hitting reply all to that email chain and providing their thoughts on an issue, at a certain point, once we cross that threshold, where a quorum of the SEC was discussing, we would have a serial meeting and a Brown Act problem. Next slide, please. So that's sort of the context. And now moving to the new legislation. So as I mentioned, AB 992 took effect January 1st of this year. And what it does is it clarifies how social media is handled under the Brown Act. So previously, and the social media simply wasn't mentioned in the Act. And while I think those of us who advise local agencies on these issues took the position that social media was treated like all other communications, it wasn't specifically discussed. So the first thing the bill does is clarify that it's totally appropriate for a member of a legislative body, including any of the SEC members, to use their own social media or agency social media to have conversations with the public and constituents about business of the DCA or about business of the SEC. You know, some things to think about in that context is, you know, it's okay to sort of answer questions or have discussions with members of the public, but we do have an obligation to hear all sides of an issue, and so we generally don't censor or block individuals. Similarly, it's possible and likely that those social media posts, if they are related to agency business, are subject to the Public Records Act, and the DCA may have an obligation to produce them, and we, you know, may need to work with you to provide copies of those in certain cases. Next slide. So in addition to clarifying that it's okay for members of the legislative body to use social media to talk about agency business, it also clarifies what it is not okay to use social media for. And there are two things that the bill identifies. The first, and I think consistent with our discussion about serial meetings, it clarifies that it's not appropriate for members of a legislative body to, for a majority of the members of a legislative body, to use social media to talk about agency business outside of a meeting. So in the same way that we can't use text messages or emails or other forms of communication to have a meeting outside of a meeting, you know, the same rules would apply to social media. In addition, and importantly, a special rule that only applies in the social media context, AB 992 says that it is not appropriate for any member of a legislative body to respond to the social media posting of another member of a legislative body if the social media posting relates to agency business. So stated differently, under this bill, it is not okay for one member of the SEC to like, retweet, respond to a social media posting of another SEC member if it's related to a topic that's within the scope of this committee. Again, just to reiterate, this is a special rule that only applies in the social media context, but it does apply to the SEC in the same way it applies to the DCA board or any other legislative body subject to the Brown Act. So, you know, what qualifies as a response is discussed a little bit in the bill, and it clarifies that it includes things like liking a Facebook post, you know, a thumbs up, an emoji, really any communication which indicates, agreement, disagreement, anything like that of a social media posting another SEC member is not permitted. Next slide. So I know there may be some questions about this, and so I wanted to open it up to that, or any comments the committee may have on the bill. Thank you.
Barbara has her hand up. Before we go to Barbara, I would just note, Josh, if folks have individual questions or really want to drill down on their own personal, how they operate on social media, what's comfortable for them, can they give you a call and you can answer those questions?
Yeah, absolutely, Val. So I'm always available to any member of the committee to talk in detail about how this might apply to your situation. Please reach out and let me know. I'm happy to help.
Awesome, thank you. So we have Barbara, Gia, and Anna who have their hands up. Barbara, Barragan-Pia, Porilla.
So if we have an item for discussion from this committee, because we're organizers, we're not government people, a lot of us. So we use social media platforms to get feedback and ask questions from people. So I'm really confused now because I feel like you wanted us to do that. You wanted us to go out and work with people. And especially during the pandemic, that's how we gather information. So I do need you to drill down a little bit on that. So, and when you're saying discussing agency business, does that mean how the SEC runs, or are we allowed to discuss a topic of discussion if we need to get feedback from people?
Yeah, so it's excellent questions. So first, your last question first on that, what qualifies as agency business? It would be any topic that we discuss at the SEC. So it isn't simply how we interact with each other. It would include substantive topics that are presented. On the how do we handle social media going forward, especially given that one of the purposes of the SEC is to try to increase outreach, right? And so I think that gets to the first part of the bill, which clarifies that it's totally appropriate for members of the SEC to use social media to talk to the public. So it is okay for you to do that. Those exchanges are not a problem. The only issue we'll have that we may run into is if you were to respond to a social media posting of another SEC member. So what you would want to do is focus your social media outreach on your stakeholder group and the public in general. And if you saw a social media posting of another SEC member, you just wouldn't want to respond to it on the social media platform.
If you have a minority of board members, are you allowed to do something together? Because some of us do work collaboratively in the community.
So yes, as long as it's not a social media posting. And I know that's that's somewhat confusing, and it's one of the difficulties with the way the bill's written that frankly we're still working through. But again, it creates a new separate standard that applies to social media postings only. So if you were, for example, to host a webinar, which doesn't qualify as a social media platform under the bill, if you were to host a webinar with less than a majority of the SEC, that wouldn't be an issue. But if you were to use, for example, Facebook to have a discussion with 3 other SEC members about a topic on Facebook through the posting, that would be an issue under AB 992. And again, Barbara, I'm happy to work with you offline to talk in detail about any specific situation you have.
Thank you.
Okay, and Gia Moreno has her hand up.
I was just following up along with what Barbara pretty much mentioned what I wanted to say, because a lot of us do work together closely. And if we're already involved with another organization that would fall under the rules of the Brown Act, which one is the one does the other one cancel the other one out?
So Gia, I'd be happy to talk to you offline about your specific situation, but to answer the question.
I think the situation applies to many of us though. For example, I'm on the Hood Town Council. Angelica Whaley is one of my, constituents in that town council, as is Dave Welch.
Yeah.
He
So
works with the town council as well.
yeah.
And the same thing with Clarksburg and some of the other towns.
So it would depend on in what forum those discussions were occurring and what you were talking about. So if you were, on, as an example, a Facebook page for the Hood Town Council, just hypothetically, and you were talking about the Stakeholder Engagement Committee, the Brown Act rules would apply, and that would be potentially an issue under AB 992 if you were having a discussion back and forth with other SEC members. By contrast, if you were attending a Zoom meeting of the Hood Town Council or another community event of the Hood Town Council, because that's less than a majority of the SEC, the normal rules under the Brown Act apply, and it would not be an issue. We would only have a concern if it was, a majority or 11.
Okay, and Anna Swenson, you have your hand up.
Hi, thank you. So the first thing is a request, and that request is for a memo that outlines how the SEC qualifies as as being covered by the Brown Act. And then the other part that I would like to see is this specific part of the new law, because I'm not a lawyer, so I need it written down so I can read it and maybe get some advice. This is really disappointing because we are not decisions. I have not made any decision on this board, even back to when we were trying to figure out whether or not we should continue on with COVID. And so we have done our very best to reach out to our community. The fellow board members are not just people that I know on this meeting, but they're like friends, my neighbors. Am I not supposed? It's very limiting if you're going to say that we can't interact with each other on social media, and it feels like another way that we're being muted. And so that's really problematic, because the whole purpose of this is for us to be transparent and for us to have a voice. And every time it seems like more and more restrictions come on as far as our voice. We aren't a large body of people. There's a very small number of us, but we're people who are here and who understand how dramatic this project will be on the communities. And I feel like I'm being silenced. And so I don't think that was your intention, but that's the outcome. It's how it's sort of panning out. And so I would really appreciate those two memos to be sent to me so that I can read this and try to understand how me on this committee is something that is covered by the Brown Act, since I don't get to vote, and not even on minutes, not even on approving the minutes. We don't even vote on that. So I'm having like a really hard time understanding, I guess, premise A for premise B to be applied to. So I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, so a couple of things. So first, I do think a memo was sent out that talked about the bill, but I'd be happy to follow up with the specific portions of the Brown Act itself, which deal with these issues, and happy to answer any questions on it that you may have after reviewing those. The other thing I'd want to note, and this isn't something that the DCA came up with, or something that frankly we wanted to put on the SEC. This was a bill that came down from the legislature. It applies to all local agencies and all local legislative bodies, and it's something frankly that all local agencies are trying to figure out how to deal with, because it does add new rules to Brown Act compliance that frankly we haven't dealt with before. And I think, speaking somewhat out of turn, and I guess frankly, it's something that I think the legislature may wish to revisit after they think through some of the consequences, like we're seeing with this body. But until that point, we do have an obligation to comply with state law. It isn't, again, a DCA policy. So that's really, why we wanted to bring this to your attention, and then talk through some of maybe some ways to deal with this, but try to make sure that you still have opportunities to interact with the community to the extent possible.
If I could make a point, Anna, I understand your pain on this, because I'm with the boards I'm on. I also am am subject to the Brown Act. And sometimes it is just incredibly frustrating. It doesn't mean that I can't, interact with people socially and, go to parties or anything like that. But we just have to not talk about, stuff that deals with our agency. And I will tell you honestly that is frustrating for all of us to a large extent.
But what is your decision is that we are covered by the Brown Act. That is your interpretation of the Brown Act legislation. And many people disagree with the fact that we are actually covered by the Brown Act because we do not make any decisions at all. We make recommendations that are taken or not taken, but we don't vote on anything. We do not have any type of drive, and our conversations in this meeting are very restricted to just the construction, not the operations, not the impacts, not how eminent domain feels, none of those things. And so I guess why I feel frustrated is that you can't have it both ways. So either you let us vote or we're not a board. And that you can't keep shuffling us back and forth across the railroad line depending on which county is going to give you the better deal on biscuits. So that's my point of view. I would like to see the memo that prescribes that we are covered by the Brown Act. I think that's even more important than this actual law. I can go up and look at the new, but I would like to see what your rationale is to why we are governed by the Brown Act, since we do not vote on anything.
Yeah,
Thank
so
you.
I'm happy to provide that, as I said, and just briefly to reiterate, the Brown Act doesn't define who qualifies as a legislative body based on whether or not they vote. And in particular, advisory committees formed by a legislative body qualify. But we can provide more detail on that. And the last thing I'd note is, when we formed this body, we indicated it was subject to the Brown Act. We've played by those rules from the beginning.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Josh. And so now let's go ahead, and we are getting on to 4B. And with 4B, well, we had introductions earlier for some of the DCA board members who have joined us. Catherine is going to provide a quick update related to the DCA board structure. So Catherine, take it away.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Next slide, Jasmine. All right, so as you've noticed today's meeting, there's some new board members of the DCA, and I just want to give you a little bit of background on that if you hadn't noticed from participating in the last DCA board meeting. So recently, last fall and into early this year, the various DCA member agencies voted on participation in the planning work for the Delta Conveyance project. And as part of that vote, they considered their level of participation in the project. They worked on a funding agreement between DWR for the program, and also they approved a revised amended DCA JPA. So just to remind you all, the Joint Power Agreement, or JPA, is the document which governs the DCA. That's what we are governed by, and it's signed by all of the member agencies. So 16 member agencies signed the amended agreement and approved funding for DCA and DWR during the upcoming planning period. Next slide. So one of the key things that was in the amended JPA was the board composition. So our previous board composition, there were 4 members, 2 from Metropolitan. There was 1 slated for Kern County, but it remained vacant because the county hadn't voted on participation at that point. Valley Water had a seat, and then all other classes were represented by a single seat. So that was the 4-member board that you previously were aware of. The new board has 7 members, and it's Metropolitan's seat reduced from 2 to 1. And then Kern County voted to participate, so now they have a seat at the table. Valley Water, and then the Class 8 contractors, that's a group of contractors down in Southern California, have 2 representatives on the board. The Class 2 agencies have a representative, and the Class 3 and 7 have a representative. So that makes up the 7 members of our new current board. And Sarah and Barbara Keegan will continue in their role as SEC chair and vice chair. So some recent board activities. The member agencies, as I mentioned, finalized their appointments of their board members and backups. That ended in January. We held a public special session in early February, and that was what we call an orientation session to get the new board members orientated with some paperwork, some background on the DCA, just some basic information to help them get better orientated to their new role. And then we held our first regularly scheduled board meeting on February 18th, which is the third Thursday of the month, which is when we routinely have our board meetings. So the reason you see a new board is largely because of this amended JPA that occurred as the various agencies approved a participation in the program. Next slide. So I'm glad to take any questions that you may have on this. And also I want to echo Sarah's comment. I thank you to a lot of the new board members and existing board members for participating in this meeting. I think it shows a commitment to stakeholder engagement, and I really appreciate it.
Douglas Shea has his hand up. Douglas?
Yeah. Who are the 16 DCA agency members?
Can we send that to you? We'll send that to you during this meeting. We have a list of it, and we can email that right out to you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Sure.
Douglas. And then Anna Swenson, you have your hand up.
Yeah, so of that composition, how many stakeholders are on the board? Like
So there's
actual stakeholders, not just agencies?
7 members that represent the 16 agencies. So some of our members represent multiple agencies. So Sarah, maybe explain your role and who you represent as a member of the DCA board.
Okay, my role is such that we are, I believe, a class 2, and there are 2 agencies that I represent. It used to be that I represented like 27 agencies, but now I represent 2, and it's for Zone 7 and Alameda County Water District. And what we're ultimately probably going to do is trade off in terms of representation between the 2 agencies. But I'm representing 2 agencies right now.
Yeah, and just if you'd like to learn more about our new members, the orientation session, each of them did an introductory an introduction of their agency that they come from and a little bit of background on them. So if you'd like to learn more about them, I encourage you to watch that video.
Yeah, and all of the folks that are on the board, they are representatives of water agencies.
So they're all agencies.
Correct.
Good. We do
Not
have
stakeholders, right?
hands up by 2 of our
Yeah.
members, but we
Okay,
also.
thank you.
Oh, thanks, Anna. We also have 2 members of our SEC who have their hands up, but we also have one more DCA board member who has joined us, Chair. Let's see, it's Adnan, bad with names. I'm sorry, I'm looking at.
It's Adnan Anabdawi.
There it is. So he vanished off my screen. I'm sorry.
Okay, Adnan. Then Adnan, what I'd like to do is we'll kind of break with this. Excuse me, but I would like to welcome him to the meeting. So Adnan, could you please introduce yourself? Tell us where you're from and what you're doing here. So we're very glad that you came. Thank you so much and welcome.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. Sorry I couldn't make it a bit earlier. I had a conflict, but joined as soon as I could here. So I am one of the 2 Class 8 board seats. That Class 8 is essentially the Southern California contractors who get water from the State Water Project on the East Branch of the California Aqueduct, so excluding Metropolitan. Yeah, I'm one of the recently appointed board members. Director Robert Chang, who I don't know if is on right now, is also a Class 8 board member. And yeah, my background has been in the water business. I've been with the Mojave Water Agency for close to 2 years now, and look forward to serving.
Welcome. We're very glad that you could come today. Okay, let's get back to that. I'm sorry.
Okay, Cece Giacomo has her hand up. Cece.
Hi, in keeping with the Brown Act, each time someone asks for information and you're going to send them out a memo or the other form of information, please send it to everyone.
Certainly.
Yeah, and Cece, just so you know, I was planning on sending that memo to the entire SEC, so everyone has a copy.
Oh, let me put out one other thing. One of the things that I do with both my board and with this board is that if I have something that I want to go out to everybody, I just send it to our attorney first and say, hey, please send this out to everybody, just to make sure that I'm not accidentally doing something against the Brown Act. But Josh on this committee has been very helpful. So go ahead and use them.
All right, and David Glosky has his hand up.
Thank you. I have 3 questions related to the board. And the first is, does the representation or the number of board members or who gets to supply board member follow with the number of dollars contributed to building the tunnel? So that was like the first question. The second would be, how is DWR involved with the board? And maybe you've covered that before, but it'd be good to get reminded. And the third thing is, I'm more familiar with corporate boards, which is always good to have outside people. It's kind of a way to, challenge yourself as a company. And has there ever been any discussion of having, some Delta participation on the board to have that voice in there? That would be my 3 questions.
All right, I can take the first one, but I can't take that last one. Proportional representation, not really. As you see, Met has 1 seat, as does Kern and Valley Water. There's an example where Metropolitan has far more of the water than the other. So it's very much distributed amongst all of the 16 water agencies to make sure that there's a good distribution of voices heard in the DCA. And in terms of the role, the DCA board governs the actions and activities of the DCA. When it was originally formed, the board was anticipating a design and construction authority. Now that we're back in planning, the JEPA clarified the role of the DCA to provide support to DWR. So there's really sort of 2 chiefs in some ways, and we've been able to navigate that really well. Is the DCA performs work at the direction of DWR under the JEPA, and we're also governed by a board of directors that's made up of representation from the state water contractors who are paying for the project. So it's a bit unique there.
All right, Josh, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just add a couple of things. One, David, if you're interested in the relative share of planning costs, that's actually attached to the bylaws that our board adopted earlier this month in the packet as an exhibit, so you could take a look at that. On the question about DWR, no, the DCA itself and its board is just a collection of the participating water agencies. The DCA's interaction with DWR is governed by our joint exercise of powers agreement, which is a contract between the DCA and DWR, which clarifies what services we're providing to DWR during the planning phase. And then on number 3, the participating water agencies, when they formed the JPA, they determined how board composition was handled.
All right.
Okay.
Sounds good.
All right.
We have one more hand up, Chair. Mel Lytle has his hand up.
Hey, good afternoon. I appreciate the introduction to the new board members. I think that's important for us to kind of understand changes on the board as it relates to activities of the project, as well as what we're doing as an SEC. On that topic, it's sometimes I'm trying to look at a way to sort of corral information in the sense that the DCA board meets independently once a month or at special meetings. SEC does as well. It's hard for me, I don't know about any of the other members of the SEC, to cover the activities of the DCA board as well as be prepared and participate in the SEC. And I'm just suggesting if there's significant actions taken at the board, that at least the SEC, maybe during a part of our program, can just be briefed on that, because I think it's important that we understand the dynamics of what's going on, outside of what we're tasked with. And so that's just a suggestion. I think it would be helpful for us to be able to understand the full picture of what's going on between the DCA board and this committee. Thank you.
Sure, we can do that.
Thank you. And that is it, Chair.
Okay, great. Oh, I do believe that that we were going to, Catherine, you were going to talk about a couple of outreach materials. I mean, I can mention them, or if you would mention them.
Yeah, thank you. So I just wanted to let everybody know also while I had you that we're working on updating the map book to include all of the Bethany information so that you have a comprehensive map book of all of the alternatives. And we're also updating the virtual tour that was on our website to update it for Bethany. We should have that posted in about 2 weeks. And we're also going to be doing 2 translations, one in Spanish and another in Chinese. For the website as well. So we're working on all of that, and you all should be getting a map book mailed out soon, and we'll also send a notification when the virtual tour update has been posted so that you can take a look at that as well.
Okay, great. And now I believe the public comment is something that we've covered already, right? Or
you have one.
Oh no, we haven't done public comment, forgive me. Do we have public comment on item number 4?
Yes, I believe we do. And by the way, I just wanted to put out the reminder to those listening who are attendees. If you do want to provide public comment, we do ask that you fill out our public comment form by 4 o'clock, and it is 3:52. So we just want to make sure that that we're all on that same page. And so for item 4, OSHA Reserve has requested a comment. Do we want to move OSHA over, please?
And if people who are doing public comment, please remember we're limiting them to 3 minutes.
OSHA, you are unmuted.
Okay.
Hello, can you all hear me?
Yes, we can. Thanks, OSHA.
Okay, great. Yeah, OSHA Reserve for local agencies of the North Delta. I just wanted to add, there was a mention of the amendments to the JEPA, and unless I missed it, I think a key point that was included in that JEPA amendment was that the $43.2 million loan to the DCA from DWR, the date for repayment of that was extended out another 2 years to January 10th, 2023, whereas on the expectation that was in place prior to that was that the deadline for those funds to be returned to DWR was January 10th of 2021. And so that raises a lot of concerns for those of us looking at the finance of the project, and especially since the districts that were asked whether they would pay for the planning costs of the tunnel in the fall, one of the reasons why I thought and others thought that was being, make sure to get that done at the end of 2020 was because there's all this funding that was put forth by DWR and that probably we don't think was authorized, and that they were going to get secure funding from the participating water agencies so that could be paid back and that problem would be, potentially resolved. So instead of that money getting paid back, a decision was made to simply continue trailing that, what I would call a debt of the JPA to DWR, and potentially putting at risk water districts that did not request to participate in the tunnel it's unclear that whether their funds are being used for tunnel activities. So I think that was very disappointing to see the JEPA get amended in that manner, and somewhat, I think, irresponsibly. And so I think that should have been included in the update given to the SEC. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that another thing that was overlooked, I think, is that when Mr. Worth resigned from the committee, he provided a letter that explained his reasoning. And I did ask him for that letter, and it is because he does not feel comfortable participating in the community benefits discussion because of concerns with the organizations he works with. And so I think it would be appropriate for his resignation letter, and if there is a letter associated with the other member who resigned, that should be provided to the other committee members so that they can see what these communications are and the reasons that these committee members are leaving the committee. Thank you.
Thanks, OSHA. And what I will note is that we are discussing financing on our agenda in item 6B. So I'll just note that, state that you may want to stay tuned for some of that discussion. Okay, I don't believe we have any other public comment, Chair.
Okay, then let's move on to item number 5, and that is technical items. And in item 5A, Environmental Program Manager from DWR, Carrie Buckman, will provide an update on the CEQA process. So take it away, Carrie.
Thank you, Chair Palmer. And it's good to see everyone again remotely. It's been a while since our last meeting. So I'm just going to provide a quick update and we'll continue through the meeting. So I know that we've seen this figure quite a bit. And so at this point, we have finished our initial outreach line on this figure, and we've moved into the second line on project definition. So a little bit about what that means. The first step here, the alternatives analysis, is us working to identify a set of alternatives. So we have a reasonable range of alternatives to include in the EIR. And we're working on that. We've presented material to you in the past about where we are, and there are still aspects that we're working on. The next step will be to define those alternatives to an extent that we can analyze them in the EIR. And a lot of that work is what the DCA is doing in collaboration with this committee. And then the third piece here is technical reports. And since this is an engineering related committee, you may think that that means technical from an engineering perspective. But really what we're talking about here is technical in relation to environmental analysis. So what this means is that we're starting some of the technical background that we need for the environmental analysis. So understanding, it focuses on things like air quality and transportation and a lot of the technical analyses that form the basis for the impact analysis in the EIR. So this is the background, more detailed work to back up what's in the EIR. So those pieces are all in various stages of movement, and this will be moving into an impact analysis and identification of mitigation. From here, as we've discussed before, we'll pull together an internal admin draft that we'll review and then release a public draft EIR in early 2022 for public review, circulation, comment, and we'll hold a series of public meetings at that time. We'll then respond to comments, put together a final EIR that incorporates those comment responses and any changes in response to those comments, and finally make a decision and document that in a notice of determination. Next slide. So a little bit of information about where we are. For CEQA, we just talked about some of that, but we're working right now on identifying the methodology for some of the different impact analyses, and we're working on the technical studies that will support that impact analysis. For NEPA, the Corps of Engineers is working to develop an EIS sort of on a similar path to what we're doing for CEQA. For soil investigations, there was field work that was completed under the initial study and mitigated negative declaration in 2020. But field work is on hold during the winter season. It's typically not very useful to go out during the wet season. And so we are going to start again in mid-March. This says April, but it means mid-March. The mid-March line and the final should have been where it says April. I think the editing got a little mixed up there. So field investigations are scheduled to start in mid-March, and outreach regarding entry permissions is starting actually next week. So one other thing to mention here is that last Friday we did release an addendum to look at some different sites under the initial study. One of the things was that when we started the initial study, we were really much earlier in this process. As we've been moving forward, we've identified the need to look in different locations. And so we did remove some sites and added additional sites. We then considered whether those new sites had the potential to change the effects that were already analyzed. And we determined that they did not change the impacts that were already analyzed. So we completed an addendum and documented that on our website, and it's available if anyone wants to take a look. Finally, we did close the Environmental Justice Community Survey in December. We're still working to compile the results into a report. There's a lot of data to compile. We do expect to be able to share that information though at our next SEC meeting, which will be in 2 months in April. So I think that's it for me. If there are any questions.
Oh, great. Okay, any questions for her? No?
Oh, we do have Gia Moreno with her hand up.
Okay.
Gia?
So I was just wondering about the scoping, and I know that that y'all are saying that it's over, but something that I brought up routinely is that I don't feel that due diligence was done as far as outreach to the communities in the Delta, especially those that are marginalized. I brought it up on multiple occasions that there's nothing in Spanish to let the people of the Delta, who we have a large population that don't speak English well or that don't read English well, that even know that this is happening. I know that the SEC is supposed to represent the different communities in the Delta, but I don't really know if there's anybody on the SEC who's fluent enough in Spanish to let the people know what's going on. There's a huge, the SEC members, before I even joined, were talking about how we need to stop the meetings during the pandemic because there's no internet in the Delta. So that left a huge amount of people without a means to voice their opinions or to gather information to even give an opinion on what was going on. So I just want to go on record as saying I don't feel like due diligence was done by the people of the Delta, especially in marginalized lower income communities. And I want to know if there is a way for them to be heard before everything keeps getting pushed through.
All right.
So talking about scoping, back when we first started this process, which was early 2020, we did release materials in multiple languages, and we do have a hotline available for people to call if they want materials in a different range of languages. When we released the Environmental Justice Survey, we had multiple languages, so we did have Spanish and Chinese available, but we do hear you that we're continuing to look at ways to try to involve different languages. One of the things that we're thinking about for this next year is how we want to reach out to communities that may not be able to attend meetings as easily as others, and definitely language is one that we're giving a lot of thought to, and we appreciate your suggestions. Nasli, I know that you're thinking about this a lot on the SEC side as well, and maybe you could offer a little bit about what the DCA is working on.
Yeah, I mean, Gia, it's tough. You were talking about the difference between sort of having the meeting and internet access versus not. I don't think this is ironic. I think there's a lot of different reasons, and I still think there's reasons why some people attend and others don't. But I will say the average attendance from members of the public at our in-person meetings were 10 to 15 people tops, and we regularly have over 50 people attending, and I'm accounting for the fact that I know some of our staff and whatnot also these meetings.
Yeah,
I think
because our town didn't even know about anything. A whole entire town that's right in the middle of everything. We weren't well informed about stuff. I mean, there were postcards that were given, but people thought they were junk mail.
Yeah, and this is tricky, Gia, and some of it has to do with finding the right folks and sort of really trusting folks when they say, I want to do this work and I can do this work. Because it is a partnership, and we understand it's a partnership with folks who oppose the project, but who still want the right information to go out. And so, we were going and leaving materials at the post office, at libraries, which are two trusted institutions within each town, I think at the firehouse as well. And it's tricky. We were holding half the meetings in Hood. So sometimes I think what's difficult, and you and I have discussed this before, is I think there are frankly I'm not taking away responsibility that we can always do better. I think we can always do better. That is just the name of the game when it comes to outreach. I also think there's a lot of gatekeepers around this project from a community side who frankly do not want word to go out, who don't want people to participate, whether that's as SEC members. Folks have definitely told me this, or even folks who comment. I've had folks who comment every week say, I get bullied and threatened by various lawyers and various folks. And so I don't want to sort of also be naive that on the other side of this discussion that I'm not particularly privy to is a whole group of folks who are making sure that people are kind of not being encouraged to attend or being told not to make comments and whatnot. So it goes both ways. I think the tricky thing is, and I don't want to fall back on the EJ survey. I mean, we had 3 people respond back to us in Spanish. So there's some sort of issue where we can put out the materials and whatnot and hope that people participate, work with folks like you to get the information out. But there's also feedback that we get when we sort of see that 300 people participate in something that's written in Mandarin, then to me that sort of cues us of like, okay, we should provide more materials in Mandarin. So we need a better feedback mechanism. That does not mean that we should not be translating our materials. But as you know, it's just incredibly difficult to sort of go through everything and have it translated. What we do try to do, and what we do realize we have to do, certainly with the materials, the tour materials, is to try to get all that basic information up. And as people come and ask for more information, then it kind of can prompt us to say, okay, there's enough people interested that we should have more meetings in Spanish, or at least have special meetings for folks in Spanish to get the word out. So,
because you and I have had the conversation, but it's like, it's a twofold thing. It's a language barrier thing, and it's an access, it's an equitable access thing as far as the internet meetings go.
It is, but what I'm saying is we actually have a lot more, and right, I understand that there's internet issues, and you're right, it's an equitable access thing. To some extent, there's more equity in the internet meetings because you don't have to travel. A lot of folks are working from home. There are folks who are able to participate now online in a way that they haven't been able to do before. There are other folks who cannot, and so I think there's a real balance. As I said, when we were holding the meetings in person, there were way fewer members of the public coming into our meetings. And I think that has to do with any number of reasons. I think it was hard for folks to get to certain locations at 3 p.m. in a way that might be easier now. So I think the equity question cuts both ways on an internet meeting versus not. But again, I also think that as we sort of have all of these materials up and all of the meetings are now have always been available online, maybe it's a chance to kind of repivot, since we've basically done most of the work of the DPA in handing our materials to DWR, to figure out how do we make sure that this information is seen by more people.
Yeah, if I might mention, I was in a meeting this morning where Garamendi was speaking, and it was he mentioned that it's a huge problem in the Delta area in terms of, say, internet access and that type of a thing. So it affects all aspects of your lives, basically.
Awesome. We do have 3 other members with their hands up: Barbara Barragan-Perea, Gil Cosio, and Anna Swenson. So Barbara?
So I'm one of those people that is worried about you getting the right information. And so we've tried to push out your surveys with membership, and we've been doing our own, of course, online work and organizing. And I think the idea of how you hit EJ communities, I think it's twofold. I mean, part of it is a digital divide, but part of it is also cultural. And so as COVID restrictions loosen up, I think it's really important to come up with a strategy to hit other groups in the Delta who are normally not on the table. You have to go get physical access and kind of build relationships. I kind of have a joke running with the water board that the state of California needs to hire hundreds of organizers because 1/3 of the people in the state still don't even know that this project is under consideration or discussion. So I think there's opportunity there for you to work in the work with Ag Innovations to be able to bring more people in to the table. And I would suggest going forward, and we're telling all kinds of institutions this, keep both things going. Get back to the public in-person work, and figure out ways to help transform that community to move over to doing this work online. I think once there's a little bit of trust, they're okay with doing it. And, you know, don't let go of the public meetings, but don't let go of being able to connect people as well. Things aren't going to change back overnight. And I just think we can disagree about things, but you have to have data. Mm-hmm. And what we've seen with COVID is you can't get to any rational anything if you can't track what's going on.
Well said, Barbara. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you. Gil Cosio.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions for Carrie. First one is, when the borings for the EIR are planned, is there any way of notifying the local reclamation district that you're going to be on the island boring? I've got a couple reasons for this. We've realized that some of the borings, even though they're in the county roadway, are actually are on the levee. And I was called back in December when one of the rec districts noticed that, and I went down and monitored the boring just to make sure that the backfill material was adequate. And luckily, the boring contractor was able to satisfy us and put some bentonite in his slurry mix to backfill. And it'd be nice to know when these borings are occurring, because sometimes there are problems in some of these areas. We might get artesian flow. And if we don't know anything about where these borings are, we can't really advise you on whether it's a good place to bore or you should be ready for problems as you bore, because we have problems and farmers have seen problems, especially if the poles aren't backfilled correctly. So, and it just so happens that one of our reclamation district clients, Bolden Island, which is owned by Metropolitan, their attorney requested permits. And so they actually put conditions on the borings on Bolden. I know Bolden has a lot more borings than most islands, but that was kind of convenient. And I had assumed that most districts would get notified, but they didn't. And so, Carrie, if we could get notification, that'd be great. It's not to stop the project, obviously, but at least to add some input if there are local conditions you need to think about. And then the second question is there a way outside of the Public Records Act to get the results of those borings, the boring logs, so we can use them for our own use when we're looking at levee issues or subsurface soil issues that could lead to seepage and that sort of thing? Thank you.
So I think that what we might want to do is actually have both of those addressed in a little bit by Andrew Finney, who's going to be talking about geotechnical investigations. I can do a little bit more about the notification procedures to see if we can work with the RDs as well. I am not probably the right person to address that, but I'll follow up. In terms of the information about how we share information later, the temporary entry permits that we have with a lot of the landowners have specifics about what can and cannot be shared and how. So I think that there is an option to share information more in aggregate, but I don't think that we can share the specific boring results. But Andrew can probably address that later in the presentation.
Does that sound okay, Gil? Because we're going to do that way we can put it in context. So I'm going to invite you to raise this again if we don't, so that we can make sure that we're dealing with the entire issue with regard to geotechnical.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, and Anna.
Yes, thank you. So, sorry, it takes me a second to get off mute. I really appreciate this. I looked through the presentation. I didn't see anything about the noise survey that you guys are trying to conduct. I think one of these meetings would be a great opportunity to try to garner some support and maybe have someone explain exactly what you want as your intention of those noise surveys, what physical aspects would the landowner need to participate, meaning like what kind of equipment's going to be mounted to a pole, and that kind of stuff. And I would really like to see a presentation on that because noise is a big issue. And then I have to say this, sorry to bring it back up again, but as someone who's really worked hard even through this pandemic to try to spread information, the social media ban is sort of, it's gonna hinder how we operate and how we share with each other and how we move information through the social media system of the Delta. And it's very difficult. Leaving stuff at libraries right now is not a good source because nobody's going to libraries. It's like the school left a notice at the school, but I don't go to the school, so how would I ever know the notice was there? So it is difficult. I would like to see more advertising for the SEC meetings and notifications such as this update, or even the noise in the post offices. There aren't that many post offices. It would take someone an hour and a half to go to every single one and put up a sheet of paper that is the main source of the communication for the Delta. So people still have to go to the PO to get their mail. And so that is a stable, consistent way to get information to people. So those are my two comments. And lastly, I totally agree with Gia. You know, communicating with individuals who really have to focus on feeding their families and taking care of their children and dealing with this very difficult time is really hard. And I wouldn't want anyone ever to accuse the DCA of taking advantage of this moment to sort of slip this project by. But honestly, I don't believe that you guys are making a conscious effort to do that, because in all the other iterations of this project, there's never been good communication with disadvantaged communities. Things have never been translated. A very limited amount of things have been translated, but the overall project wasn't able to be translated for people of different languages to be able to read it. And so this is an ongoing, you've adopted this problem. I hope that you can be creative in ways that you can solve it. So thank you.
And Anna, I sent everyone at the SEC an email about the noise monitoring stuff based on the presentation that we had a few months ago, but I can ask for, I can first of all find the clip in the video that sort of goes to the noise monitoring, but I can also ask the folks to kind of repackage it and get the info out if that works.
I think that would be really great, Natalie, because we want people to participate in it, right? So there has to be, I know, and I apologize for making you redo that again, but if we, sometimes we have to ask people twice, you know, to see if we can garner some support. But I think it's really important that we do that noise survey. I think it's going to be valuable information for you guys because, you know, sound travels way different out here.
Yeah, no, that's
I hear my nice neighbor when she sings country music and washes her dishes each evening, and that's a fact. So,
the other thing, Josh did such a great job of kind of talking us through the Brown Act thing, but I would also say, Anna, for you, from the more political sense, this was obviously not our idea, and it might not be the worst idea to call for folks who feel the same way Anna does about the Brown Act rules and social media, to actually call your legislatures, legislative folks, and let them know how you feel and kind of some of the issues that it brings up. I don't think, I said this to you, Anna, I'm sure the road to hell is littered with good intentions. I'm sure the intent was not to close the ability to communicate, but it might not be a bad idea to get feedback directly from stakeholders on what this means. Okay.
All right, we have no other hands up. If you want to move on to the next item.
All right, let's move on. Let's go on to item 5B. And DC Executive Director Catherine Mallon, I'd like you to introduce our discussion on the Bethany alternative. So please take it away.
Sure. So our in-house Bethany expert, Phil Ryan's going to walk us through. What we want to do is, you know, we've been through all of this material already with you in the previous meeting. So we just want to do a summary highlight of the Bethany alternative and the key findings, and just garner any final comments that we might get out of this group as we begin to wrap up this Bethany alternative concept design for DWR. So Phil, you want to pop up and give a highlights review of what they've heard to date on Bethany?
Okay, thanks, Catherine. Yeah, and like Catherine mentioned, it's going to be kind of a quick overview. We'll hit on the salient points of the Bethany alternative. You've seen it all before. Most of it a little bit in pieces. We'll go through the whole thing, but not in the same level of detail we did before. And then hopefully the discussion section with the committee at the end, you can bring up any points that maybe you've been thinking about over the last few weeks and you know, didn't think about when we did this before. So let's start off with the basics. As you'll remember from the graph on the right, the purple section at the top is the same as the eastern corridor. And then the green section at the bottom is the modification for the Bethany alternative. So again, it uses the eastern alignment at the top above Lower Roberts. And then on the southern end, there's 2 additional maintenance shafts. You see those are the white dots there at Upper Jones and Union Island. And then the tunnel reach from Lower Roberts extends to what we're calling the Bethany complex, which is down right next to, basically right next to the CVP facilities that pump out of the lower part of the Delta Mendota Canal up into the upper part for its travel south. The pumping plant then is at that location. It diverts flow right up out of the tunnel and discharges it through a discharge structure along the shores of the Bethany Reservoir. Go ahead, Jasmine. Thank you. So this is a good key difference slide. As you can see, the central and eastern alignment that we've gone over in many meetings came down to the southern forebay, where there's where we do the pumping plant diverted out of the tunnel into the southern forebay, and then it flowed by gravity through another set of dual tunnels and some control structures into the channel that feeds the state's Banks pumping plant. So as you see, the difference with Bethany is well, for one thing is the tunnel is starting at Lower Roberts instead of down at Southern Forebay. So we're going to originate at the eastern alignment up there and then tunnel south instead of north. And then our pumping plant doesn't deliver to the suction side of another pumping plant. Our pumping plant actually delivers to the discharge side of that other pumping plant, eliminating the need for both the existing system and the new system to both be dependent on the Banks pumping plant. One of the big impact issues, or the big facility issues, I should say, is we don't have a southern forebay because we don't have to balance between the two dual conveyance facilities in the same way. So we don't need that southern forebay. And then by not needing the southern forebay, we don't have the same use for the RTM in the project because of that. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute, okay? So as you may recall, the tunnel comes in at the Bethany complex to the pumping plant in that reception shaft you see there under the surge basin. And then there's another buried conduit, a big box, if you will, that comes off the side of that tunnel shaft and feeds into the middle of the pumping plant, where the pumps are lifted up into buried aqueduct pipelines that go up to the reservoir. And you can see we have like a surge tank in the back of each of those aqueducts for the pipeline surge. And then the surge basin is for the tunnel surge. And then there's the various supporting buildings, electrical buildings, the substation and all. And again, it's right across the street, Mountain House Road, from the Tracy substation, which is right next to the Jones pumping plant. Okay. And then, as you'll recall, the aqueduct comes out of the pumping plant, travels on the path shown there up to the reservoir. We showed you an alternatives analysis of where we went through and looked at different routes. There's 2 tunnels along the route. One is to cross the discharge pipelines coming from the Central Valley Project's pumping plant on the Delta Mendota Canal there. And then the other one is to get underneath the conservation easements you see there to avoid any impacts to the flora and fauna on that conservation easement, which is what it's there for. And you can see it's a little longer than the conservation easement, and that's because of the topography in the area. In order to find a good tunnel location without going up and down a bunch of hills, we had to tunnel in a little bit further back. And then the discharge structure there on that northerly shore of the Bethany Reservoir. Okay. So, and then here's the discharge structure. You can see a little 3D graphic of the structure up there at the right that fits in kind of the light gray. You can see there the tunnels come into it. There's a tunnel for each of the 4 aqueducts for the 6,000 CFS capacity. They come up in these shafts, you can see sort of in the bottom of the 3D graphic, and then they would flow out through some control gates into the reservoir. It's a pretty passive structure. This structure doesn't do much but redirect the flow coming up out of the tunnel into the reservoir itself. And you can see the cofferdam and silt curtain and that kind of thing that would be there during construction, and some of the area we need to support constructing that structure. So as I mentioned before, we're not using the RTM for the southern forebay, but we still have RTM to manage. So, and as I also mentioned before, we're not tunneling from way down south. One of the interesting things about the Bethany alternative is there's really only 2 substantial tunneling sites on the project. One at Twin Cities, which goes both north and south to the intakes and then down to terminus right there at Highway 12. And then the Lower Roberts, which is just a little bit west of the Port of Stockton. And again, it goes both north and south. So all of the major activities and the RTM are focused at those locations. So we generate about a little over 6.5 million cubic yards at Twin Cities and about 7.5 million cubic yards at Lower Roberts. And like I said, there's no southern forebay, so there's really no need to move the RTM from Twin Cities or Lower Roberts for that matter to a different site. So we looked at 2 options for managing that RTM, either stockpiling it at these sites or hauling it off site by rail or truck. So next one, please, Jasmine. So these are the 2 alternatives that we looked at. Graham went over these a couple months ago in a little bit more detail, but we selected option 1 to store it on site. And the pro reasons for that are a substantial reduction in truck traffic and the associated air emissions that go along with trucking that material to a disposal location. It's approximately 83 million truck miles, so that's quite a bit of truck miles. It does leave the material available for Delta area reclamation districts or other beneficial uses. Some of the information about levee repair needs, some of the studies that have been done indicate maybe about as much as 13 million cubic yards are needed for that, and that happens to line up pretty well with the amount that we would be having available. And the on-site stockpiling also gives time for industry to advance electrifying, say, hauling vehicle technology, so that maybe these vehicles will be available and it can be moved off-site without making the same kind of environmental impact. And then the cons associated with that option are the aesthetic issues of these 15-ish foot high stockpile materials over pretty large areas at the sites, and those significant land requirements required during the process for drying it. Even though we don't dry it the same way we would for using it for an embankment, we still just can't you can't stockpile muck. You gotta dry it out a little bit so it's a material that you can compact into a pile. And then the offsite disposal, the wasn't selected. It would have obviously less construction and permanent area required at those 2 sites, but the cons to that were the significant truck traffic and the greenhouse gases and the traffic on the highway system, and the material wouldn't be available for anybody to make some beneficial use of it down the road. So with that analysis, option 1 was selected, and that's what we're moving ahead with at this time. And then the last item I'm going to cover is we went over the traffic effects and remediations. I don't know if you remember, Don Hubbard did a fairly detailed evaluation of all the different traffic and the different roads and the impacts of our construction traffic on those roads. And two main areas came out to need some effort thought about it. The getting out to Lower Roberts on State Route 4 was going to push us up into category F, as I believe. But by getting all those workers into a park and ride and reducing their traffic by an order of magnitude, really reduced the amount of traffic going to that site and made it so that we don't have an unacceptable impact in that area. And then down around the Byron Highway area, down at that Bethany complex, there's a whole variety of issues with the Byron Highway traffic. So we found ways to work with some of the work that's going on down there to make the stretch of the highway we need to use handle the traffic without significant impacts, put a new interchange down there. And we've also split up the traffic to have several different ways to get to the site for different people coming from different directions and for different materials coming from different directions. So I think that completes it, but like Catherine and I both at the introduction, we're happy to hear anything you've been thinking about on Bethany, over the last few months that maybe you haven't had a chance to share with us to date.
All right, we do have some hands up. Karen, we haven't heard from you yet, so I'm gonna go to you first. Karen Mann? I threw her off because she was number 3. All right, so we'll start with Anna.
Oh, there she is.
Oh, are you back, Karen? All right, hello, Karen.
Okay, thank you, Phil, for a really good video or photos. I look forward to sharing that with my community down here. But my main question is, has anybody reached out to the residents of Mountain House? Mountain House is not necessarily part of Discovery Bay. In fact, it's not at all. And Mountain House has its own community. And since it will be closer to them and the traffic's going to affect them more, I think that a concerted effort to have them included on the SEC committee.
So Karen, we in fact have, we've had a couple of discussions with Mountain House, and most recently we had a fairly detailed discussion with Mr. Anush Najad, who I believe is on the call today.
Yes.
Fantastic.
So we have coordinated, mainly, it's mainly around traffic that we've talked to them, but we have introduced the whole project to their team.
Okay.
If I could speak.
Thank you.
Please. Go ahead, Anush.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, we have a very good discussion, and we have given to DCA the comments that we had with generally regarding the traffic on Byron Road and on Grand Line Road. And I have also shared with them the plans that we have for the widening of Grand Line Road, especially at the intersection that was proposed to be upgraded, so that the two projects could be coordinated or they are not in conflict. The major concern that we have on Grand Line Road is that this is the main commute for our residents, and we were concerned about the truck traffic during the peak hours. And so I'm going to be submitting a letter and requesting that the truck traffic to be set during the times that it would not interfere with the peak hour commute for the residents, because that corridor is already at level of service F, and with any additional truck traffic, that would make it very difficult for the residents to be able to get to the freeway. So I think our issues have been addressed, and I will be sending a letter as a follow-up to the discussion that we had.
And Karen, to follow up on that, I've told you we've also did a whole presentation on the overall project, not just traffic, where Mr. Najad is concerned, with the manager of the Mountain House Community Council. I had actually emailed all of the board members as well, but was told that was a violation of their Brown Act for writing to all of them. So we have communicated with the manager and have made it very clear that if they would like to hold a larger community meeting, that we, of course, would be happy to show up, but they have all the materials necessary, and it's been communicated with them for the last many months.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Anna Swenson, you have your hand up?
Yes, thank you. So I have a question and then I have a comment. My question is, at what point are we going to start notifying the folks on Twin Cities that they're going to have a lot of activity and potential widening? And I think it would be helpful to have some in-depth discussion about what that will look like and how it will impact the local community there. I think that people are really caught off guard and aren't aware of all of your plans for Twin Cities, and Twin Cities is a major commuting, hauling road that is very, very important to the communities out here, and I think we need to be as transparent as possible about what the plans are in store for it. And then the other thing is, of course, I have to comment on RTM because that's my trigger in this project. And I guess my question is for Gil Cosio, like, Gil, is there actually a use for RTM in levee repair? Because I've been watching a lot of the levee repair out here recently on 744 and some of it on Merritt, and I can't imagine them using RTM, but maybe I'm wrong. You're an engineer.
Well, if the material is adequate, we could use it mostly as tow berms in non-project levees. So the levees you're talking about, project levees, which are built by the federal government and maintained by the state and locals. The non-project levees are the ones in the deeper peat areas that we need to tow berm. And some of the work the Metropolitan Water District's been doing, since they now own levees in the Delta, has shown that these tow berms are can really benefit the levee as far as seismic resistivity. So it's possible. The problem I can see is that the location on Twin Cities Road is not conducive to hauling it to where we need it. And so that could make it hard to use if the price to haul it and place it is
Where is it most needed? Just out of curiosity.
I think, go ahead and answer, Gil, but I think we're getting into the logistics of the actual project. That
I was just curious.
Topic, in other words, yes.
Follow up with you, Gil.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Catherine.
Okay,
right.
move on.
Barbara Bergen-Perea. Gil, you know we want to always hear you because we love to hear you wax on about your engineering knowledge. That's good stuff, to be honest.
I know too much. I sit here muted. I yell at the computer while I'm muted.
Thank you. Seriously, thank you for providing your thoughts. All right, Barbara Bergen-Perea.
So it was a good presentation to go back and look at the details for what is being conceptualized for the Bethany alternative. My question is really directed towards Carrie. So because we're really working on construction aspects, it's about, can you move something here or can you move it there, or what will be the impact to this piece of land? This alternative is floating out there. And then we had Carla Nemeth make a video where she talks about how, water quality standards are going to be held for so long in the Delta when discussing the project, but really kind of gets at the fact that water quality standards could change with operation of this design. So my question or problem is, and hope is, that the EIR is really going to robustly deal with this issue, because from where I sit today, and I think about that we're doing our due diligence as SEC members, helping to critique on how to minimize construction impacts. But then we're going to have an EIR, and then we have this narrative of beyond the project. Once the project is built, how it's operated could change. And I'm getting worried that this feels like piecemealing. it feels like piecemealing under CEQA. And I'm worried that full mitigation discussions are not happening when they should be happening now to deal with probably the biggest issue. You know, people garden and construct things all the time. Engineers, you all take everything apart and put it back together. But what are the long-term impacts really going to be with operation? And where, you know, we always go into the circular conversation is, I worry about that, because if you don't know that, then how can we fully critique properly the design? So it's a little bit of a comment and it's a little bit of a question, but I am really worried about this piecemealing aspect, and that we are not dealing with the 500-pound gorilla in the room. Thank you.
So I can certainly talk about that a little bit. Val, is that okay?
Oh, yeah.
For you? Okay. So I think that there's, you know, one of the things that we've run into a lot as we work through this is that it's hard to analyze anything without knowing what the project facilities look like, but there's a lot of concern that we're then defining the project facilities in a way that might have impacts. And so there's this, you know, chicken or egg situation, right? Which comes first? And so what we've chosen to do here is we've worked with the DCA to define the project first.
Sure.
We've asked them to try to minimize impacts to communities as they're doing that, but they could only really work with a set of information because they haven't really had all of the information to work with.
Right.
So what we're doing now is we're analyzing impacts based on the alternatives that we have and the information that the DCA has provided us. When we have that set of impacts, we will be looking at ways to avoid, minimize, or mitigate for those impacts. So if we find, for example, let's say that we have a shaft site that has noise impacts to a local sensitive receptor, and we didn't know that sensitive receptor was there. We would talk to the DCA and say, hey, the shaft site has some issues. Can we move it? Can we build a sound wall? Are there engineering solutions to that? So we may end up with an engineering solution. If not, there may be other avenues that we explore, different kinds of equipment. So there's sort of this suite of options. Many of them involve coming back to the DCA, working with the DCA to try to make some modifications to the project design. Specific to operations, while we aren't talking about that here in the SEC, that's certainly a major component of the EIR and something that we'll be analyzing in depth there. We haven't gotten to the point that we can talk about mitigation yet because we haven't assessed any potential impacts. So what we're doing now is we're working on defining operations and then analyzing if there are potential impacts, and then we will get to mitigation. We're just not there yet.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. And Douglas Shia.
Yeah, I have two questions. Okay, first question is, at the height of the construction, how many TBM will we have at the same time?
Phil?
Sorry, I was on mute. Could you repeat it again, please, Douglas? I wasn't completely.
How many RTMs would be going simultaneously?
TBM, okay.
TBM.
I believe we would have, Bethany, there would be 4 at the peak. They don't all start at the same time, but I think they would all at some point in time be running at the same time.
On the Bethany alternative?
Yeah, the 2 from each launch shaft.
Second question is, okay, since the Bethany alternative aligns better with the eastern alignment, so what is the chance that we will not choose the eastern alignment?
I can't comment on the choice. That Carrie might be able to comment, but we provide the DCO the information and they go through their environmental analysis, and I believe the chips fall where they may as part of that analysis. So I really can't comment on that, Douglas.
We're neutral, Douglas. We just do the engineering work.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, so that's something that we'll work on based on the ability of each alternative to meet our objectives and which alternatives have lesser environmental effects.
Thank you.
All right, and we have 2 more hands up, Mike Moran and Mel Lytle. Mike?
Thank you. Hey, Phil, thanks for that presentation. I got a question about the RTM. We have 14.1 million acres coming out. And do we expect to lose any of that in volume from either compaction, drying, or erosion over the life of that stockpiling?
So I wouldn't really expect to lose any through erosion. So I guess it's a question. We're not going to lose any, really. Now the question is, what its volume will change depending on, you know, what we call, when we dig it out of the ground, we call that a bank volume, and then it fluffs up into, you know, the loose excavated volume, and then we dry it and it shrinks a little bit because the water comes out, and then we compact it back into place. To be honest with you, I can't tell you for sure, Mike, which numbers I have up there. Graham did that, but we've accounted for it all in the same number. But
Phil,
so this
is Graham. Phil, do you want me to
okay.
answer?
Yeah, that'd be great, Graham.
Yeah, thanks, Graham. Thanks, Phil.
Sure. Mike, it's you know, as it turns out, so everything Phil described is totally accurate. As it turns out, when it comes out of bank and bulks, it's 1.3. Then we've got a water reduction factor as it dries, and then a compaction factor as it's put back into place. As it turns out, our factor is 0.99 from bank to compact.
Oh, all right. So pretty much the volume you dig is pretty much the volume you have in
and the reason it's different compared to like a surface excavation where it's usually on the order of 0.9 or something, that conversion is because it's coming from depth. And so it's a bit more compressed, you know, it's in a bit more consolidated compressed state down at depth.
And we're adding water to it, Graham.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a pretty, so 14.1 million is going to hold up, and the 13.1 million in need would be.
So that 14.1, Mike, was that 14.1 was the wet quantity. So that's the 1.3 bulked quantity that we're going to be dealing with at the surface.
Okay.
And then it will be dried to a certain extent and compacted into place. So it does shrink at the surface.
Okay, so what I'm really getting at here is how does that 14.1 million RTM compare to the suggested 13.1 million in need? Will the need ever, will we drop down below the need for levee repair and things like that? Or will we bank on this as sufficient for the 13.1 million cubic yards needed for levee maintenance?
Well, I'm doing math really quick right now. So 14.1 times 0.99 divided by 1.3. We wouldn't have enough to, if all of this material, you know, as Gil mentioned, it's more or less usable in different ways for this levee repair. I'm not sure that whole 13.1 is all the kind of material that we would be able to use this for, but we would have a substantial quantity of this material. It may not meet the full 13.1, but it should. There's usually a pretty big rush for people wanting usable material, especially if it's free.
If it couldn't satisfy it all, Mike, it would put a very large dent in it.
Yeah.
Great. All right. That's perfect. Thanks so much.
Sounds good. Mel Lytle, you're next.
Thank you. I'll keep on the same subject matter. I think that this kind of reminds me of the placer mining days of California history, where these giant water lines were blasting mountains apart to go after gold. But at the same time, now we're looking at giant tunneling machines that are going to spew this stuff all over the Delta. And it's kind of upsetting. I think that you're looking at sort of bookend alternatives in the sense that you're trying to accommodate less impact to climate change with the direct impact you would have with these stockpile sites to windblown dust, erosion, contamination due to whatever might be in the material. And so it seems a little odd to me that you're looking at future climate change and less truck trips and diminishing the direct impact of the stockpiled material in the Delta. The concept that this material won't move is not correct. Breach a levee on Lower Roberts, and that material is going to go everywhere it wants to go. Breach your containment levee at Twin Cities due to Consumers River flooding, it'll do the same thing. That material is something that has to be dealt with, and stockpiling is a very, very poor option. There's lots and lots of evidence of this in a lot of different areas around the world. Whether or not it's stockpiled materials from mining, tailings, things of that nature, tailings dams, things of that nature, contamination due to that thing is something that really needs to be evaluated. So I think that this is something you really need to look at it in a more defined way. I think there's better middle ground than doing one or just the other. The concept of it being a flood levee building material, that may or may not be the case. You don't have enough information as far as your soil borings yet. The real key issue to levee improvement isn't not necessarily the material, but the money to do the project. That's where it really comes in. If you have a material that may help on tow berms and things like that, that could discount the overall project, but you still have to move it, as Gil was talking about. And Twin Cities, and I know Catherine, you're interested as well, but to move material a long ways increases the cost. And that's what makes or breaks a lot of levee projects. Thank you.
Yeah, Mel, I think, you know, as I think we talked about this at the meeting. I mean, we're pretty certain that there's going to be some electrification of the fleet in the future, in the near future. So this is going to be something that can get revisited in the future.
But it's
and I
I'm
think
not going to argue with it, but it's essentially a redirected impact. You may not have, you may have an electric powered semi that can move materials around, but it's going to require that that vehicle be charged. And so where is that? Are you going to make sure and dedicate that all the power that goes to recharge those trucks are based on green energy or renewable energy?
So I think we're at that point where, you know, we're working off the information we have at this point, understanding that there are definitely changes happening. We are definitely in transition, particularly in the state of California. And so at some point it may make sense to have a SCC discussion on new technology and what that means, you know, probably in the future, maybe a year or so down the, maybe months down the road. But for the moment, I think we are where we are, and why don't we continue the discussion and you know, see what we can come up with based on our current dynamic. Jim Cox, you have your hand up.
Yeah, well, what I was curious about is when you're making up your environmental impact report, are you going to be counting on electric vehicles that don't exist now, or are you counting on? Are you just using the information from vehicles and you know, equipment that you have now?
We are not counting on the use of any equipment that does not currently exist.
Correct.
Thank you.
I guess, Jim, my point was in the future, this may get revisited.
Yes, but that's in the future, and now we have to deal with what we've got right now. So let's continue on with this issue right now. Otherwise, we're going to go forever.
All right, and we have no other hands up. And as promised, Chair Palmer.
Okay, let's get on then to the geotechnical fieldwork. Catherine, can you introduce this item, please?
Yeah, we wanted to give you an update on the work that we've done so far. We've got some preliminary data that we want to share with you, and Andrew Finney, who is the lead geotech engineer on the program, is going to run you through what we've received to date. So Andrew, go ahead.
All right, Jasmine, next slide, please. Yeah, so Catherine asked that we give you, an update, like she said, on where we are. We have completed 21 soil explorations this fall, and we have an approximately 65 additional soil explorations planned to be completed between this spring and the 2021-2022 exploration season. We've had some challenges. We've sort of originally developed our field program to minimize inconvenience to private landowners, and I think we elected to explore within county and state right-of-way wherever possible. And unfortunately, we had a group of attorneys threatening us with claims about underlying ownership rights. We had San Joaquin County invoking additional restrictions on explorations after they had issued us valid encroachment permits, and we'll address all those issues with DWR in the coming weeks. We experienced protests that had people blocking busy roads and required the sheriff and CHP to show up, all fun stuff. And unfortunately, while the issue is resolved, we've had to relocate all of our explorations that were planned into private property. And so I think that's meaning that more temporary entry permits are going out to private landowners. We've had, obviously in the fall and winter, we had challenges with the weather, as any field exploration project does, some rain. We've had challenging drilling conditions. The Delta is, as Gil knows, is subject to, there's deep sequences of sand that are under artesian pressures that are challenging during drilling, to say the least, and that's been challenging. And also, the need to schedule around agricultural operations, making sure that we're not, in the fall time we're not in the way of trucks, and harvesting operations. So it's been challenging. We're looking forward to the spring and some drier weather, and that'll be good. This image here just shows some of the planned explorations. That's good. So I think it's pretty germane to what people on the SEC were talking about with regard to, sorry, go ahead, next slide, Jasmine. Germane to what we were just talking about here. We've got, previously we had completed environmental testing on soil samples that came from various deep depths below the Delta. And we'd also done some environmental testing on samples to determine the constituents of tunnel additives, such as the foaming agents that the tunnel boring machines use. And we presented that to the SEC previously. There's no indication that any data we have currently suggests that this is in any way harmful to the environment or to people. There were a number of questions that were related to that. In particular, there were some constituents that were not well represented in the testing, including methyl mercury and hex chrome. Those are two of the bad actors. They get a lot of press all over the West and globally. And so what we did was, in an effort to understand the differences between the surface soils and the tunnel soils, we conducted a series of tests both at background, which was the 0 to 3 feet samples, what we call shallow, which was 0 to 10 feet, which is primarily at locations that might have future excavations for any potential project, and then tunnel depth samples. So for instance, you can see all the green ones were completed this fall, the borings that were planned at those locations. So for instance, at Glanville Tract, we had both a background and a shallow and a tunnel depth sample to compare against each other. Same with Lower Roberts there. We had a background, a shallow, and a tunnel depth sample there. And on the right there, you can see the image shows that we generally picked locations. We've got another one at the Southern Complex that we intend to complete this spring, but they are scattered across the Delta to try and capture a representative slice of the conditions there. And so the next, let's see, so next slide, please, Jasmine. So this is just sort of a a very brief summary of what we found. The major metals, again, we were looking at things like methylmercury and arsenic as well. They were all at non-detect levels or extremely low levels, with the exception of arsenic. I think we've discussed before that arsenic is a naturally occurring metal that's present a lot in the West, and I'll show you some results from that. And then also there were other analytes that we looked for, hydrocarbons, pesticides, things like that. Almost all of those came back as non-detects. We did have some trace at the surface, and I'll get into that in the next slide. You can, next slide please, Jasmine. So walking our way around this plot, there's a lot of information here, but you see along the top there, you have the sample locations. I told you that, so like for instance, Lower Roberts, Glanville, Staten, and Bolden, each generally had a shallow and tunnel, shallow and tunnel. We actually composited the very shallow sample from 0 to 3 feet in some cases with the 10-foot sample to get an average. Bolden only had a shallow sample. We didn't do any really deep tunnel borings in the fall. And so, for instance, arsenic, generally we find arsenic that's in line with typical background results. So, and similar to what we had as, quote, prior results. So on the far right, you see prior results. And the very far right, you see California reference limits. And those reference limits are generally early screening values for either residential use of a property or commercial use of a property. They're just giving us a guidance as to whether or not these values are of significant concern. They are all generally within the realm at depth, arsenic levels of what we saw before. We are seeing higher levels in the shallow soils, likely the result of rodenticides and pesticides used as part of ag operations. And actually at Staten, we saw some quite high shallow numbers in the arsenic. That shallow composited value is actually an average of a high number and a very high number. So again, tunnel values are lower at depth with arsenic and generally within the range of background levels. Cadmium had come back with some non-hazardous, just benign, very low detections in the prior work. We believe that possibly was an anomaly with the laboratory they were using. They were all non-detect in these samples. That was good at both shallow and deep samples. Hexavalent chromium, which is a challenging, quite a little more toxic, I suppose, and carcinogenic. Non-detects on all of those samples, both at shallow and deep depths, which was excellent news. Same thing with mercury, just plain old, good old-fashioned mercury. We don't find any mercury in either the shallow soils or the deep tunnel soils. Methylmercury, on the other hand, we did find some very, very low trace levels at a couple of our shallow samples. Again, possibly related to actually, I've heard one scientist estimate that most of our surface mercury comes from coal-burning power plants in China, believe it or not, and that they were not surprised to see methylmercury show up in very shallow samples. But again, nothing in the tunnel depth. And then the last constituent was just a reference of a typical, quote, contaminant, right, which is total petroleum hydrocarbons as motor oil. All of those were non-detect at the tunnel depth, which is what you'd expect. And then we had detections of motor oil in all of the shallow samples, I believe. But those levels are very, very, very low. You see here on the right, the reference limits for just a residential scenario are 2,400, and we're talking about 20 to 106. So these are very low levels, again, in the naturally occurring surface soils of the Delta. So conclusion here is 100% consistent with the prior conclusion. There is nothing in the tunnel RTM material that is any way hazardous or is any way different. In fact, in some ways, it's less, quote, contaminated, I use that truly in quotes, but it has less constituents than the surface soils when it comes to things like motor oil and arsenic. So anyway, generally good news there. Obviously, this is not the last of the environmental testing. Environmental testing will go on continuously throughout the geotechnical exploration program. And we will focus again on those tunnel zone versus shallow surface excavation soils to make sure that we really understand, Mel, you were talking about, RTM and becoming dustborne and things like that. So, we want to understand what we're bringing to the surface with RTM and what's already there, possibly presenting a risk. So I think that's the last slide, Jasmine. So I'll open it up to questions.
Okay, and we have a couple hands up. Anna, you have a question? Anna?
Sorry, pressed the wrong button. So a couple of things. One, I think it would be foolish to say that your testing looks good. There isn't anywhere near enough sampling for the huge area that you're testing. And so I don't think that's a fair assumption. And the other thing I would like to say is, as the person that was actually protesting the geotech, we never blocked roads. We communicated with the county sheriff. We had permission from the landowner, even when the drillers did not have permission from the landowners and had their equipment and their personal vehicles parked on a landowner's property without permission and ended up moving it. They were not wearing masks, and they had such terrible traffic control on Twin Cities that myself and another person actually witnessed a near car accident. And when the sheriff and the county guy came out, he forced them to put up better signage farther out because an accident was going to happen that had nothing to do with our protest. So I really want you to be earnest and honest about what is preventing you from completing this. And it is not a couple of ladies holding up signs and protesting the geotechnical drilling, because I was there, and the county and law enforcement both supported us. They both said that we were totally in the right. We were not given any warnings, but the crew that was doing the geotechnical was given warnings about not following health protocols and wearing masks. They were given out warnings against not having sufficient traffic controls on those busy roads, and that there was accidents that almost happened in front of the law enforcement. And so you need to be more honest about what you're representing in these meetings, because you make it sound like the people of the Delta were preventing them from doing their job, and in really we were doing what is our given right, which is to protest, and which is to openly and freely use our rights as for free speech. So please make that correction, and I want that noted in the minutes. Thank you.
Okay. Andrew or Barbara, you have your hand up.
Thanks. So I have a couple questions. We do agree with Anna that I worry about the sample size, particularly around the mercury issue and methylmercury issues. I would refer you all to the work done by Dr. Fraser Schilling at UC Davis. He has done an incredible amount of tracking around mercury and methylmercury issues in the Delta. He is a source that is used regularly at the water boards. So as you're probably testing soil, you might even want to use that as a source document to think about where you need to be looking or analyzing. The second item, I need a little help here. I understand that mercury methylizes when introduced with nitrates. Now, where you did your samples, it didn't look like there was legacy mercury at any notable level. My question though is, if you find this in other places, doesn't it change into methylmercury because of nitrogen pollution? And then that's when you really end up with the water contamination problem. My understanding is that the size of a quarter of methylmercury would make a swimming pool deadly for you or me to swim in. So, you know, the samples are small, but methylmercury is so dangerous, it really doesn't take much. So those are my questions. Thank you.
Right, I'll start with the first one. Yeah, I think the last thing I said was we would continue to sample the environmental the geotechnical samples that we obtain will be suitable for environmental testing, and that testing won't stop. I think the point was to give you an update during our winter pause on where we were, what we had found, and share that with you. It was by no means, I think what we heard from the earlier SEC meeting when we had presented a reanalysis of legacy data that had been collected between 2009 and 2017 was there were no red flags, but there were data gaps. And some of those data gaps were around methyl mercury. And maybe even Barbara, you were the one that brought that up. I seem to remember.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, so we were definitely addressing the SEC's concerns. And no, and I do not mean to intend that this is a sample size suitable of giving the RTM a clean bill of health.
Okay.
Absolutely. It's just, yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry, you're just sharing what you've got so far is what you're saying.
Exactly.
Okay. All right.
Exactly. And then with regard to methyl mercury, and I'm not a groundwater or soil chemist, I'll tell you that, but I do understand that it's not only the nitrates, but it also has to be the pH has to be in a particular range in order for that compound to begin to form. And, and it's generally a very low oxygen, I believe, a reducing environment. But, I think you're right in observing that we would not expect to find, we found trace elements or trace amounts of methyl mercury at the surface. We did not find mercury per se. Mercury, in my mind, is more, associated with legacy mining, gold mining, obviously, and being used to leach the gold out of the alluvial soils that they washed into the rivers. And I would not expect to see a lot of mercury outside the historic river channels, if you will. And so that didn't surprise me. I would have been more surprised to find a lot of naturally occurring mercury in the ground. But you're absolutely right, Barbara, that where groundwater is in contact with surface water and where there is mercury in the surface sediments in the old rivers that's moved down from gold rush days, right? It can be a serious issue. I agree with you.
Okay.
Okay, and we have Mel Lytle and Jim Cox with their hands up. Mel?
Yeah, excuse me, thank you. Andrew, interesting data. I think that just a couple of recommendations. It would be good to report all your detects, on any of the elements that you were looking for. I think that would be fair, whatever the part per million or part per billion levels they are. I think it would be helpful because you have the question going, okay, what happened to the rest of the analysis that you did? I understand this was a summary. Also, I think that using your reference for industrial and residential reference criteria, I think that maybe you could put that a little bit more down onto environmental terms for either agricultural or environmental use, that type of thing. I think that's a fair look at the quality of that oil that comes up from depth. Also, it would be good to report chloride concentration in the soils. I think that's something that's outside of heavy metals. I understand that, but chloride is going to be a bugaboo with you because if you've got high chloride levels in your RTM, that's going to be a problem going forward.
That's a good point.
Also, did you also test groundwater at depth or no? Okay.
No, just soil samples this time.
Okay, that would be an interesting data point as well.
I agree.
Because typically when you look at this type of thing, you look at definitely your soils analyses, but they can do also groundwater analyses to look at what's essentially available in the water column itself, as well as sometimes they can use what they call a pore water sample. But anyways, thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate your effort, and when you get to some more data, it'd be interesting to look at.
Yeah, and you're right, Mel. The point was to summarize some of the major concerns, some of the major metals and things that were raised as constituents of concern with RTM in the prior SEC meetings. And chloride, that's an excellent point. And we have the chloride data, and we have all the data. I mean, we run full EPA suites. I mean, data than you could deal with, but all of that will be shared and part of the part of the record here, because it analyzed for every single kind of pesticide and metals and you name it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Good discussion. Jim Cox, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I'm kind of confused on your chart there. If you could put that back up.
Sure.
Okay, on that column on the far right, reference limits. Now on the arsenic, it shows a range of 0.11 to 3.6, but yet on your findings, there's only one number there that is in that range. Everything else is way over it. And so you don't seem to be concerned. And so can you explain to me, just what that all means?
Yeah. So it's something that environmental professionals deal with all the time in California and generally in the West, and especially here in the Valley, we have high naturally occurring arsenic. It's just a fact of life. It was in the rocks that formed the Sierras, and so it's weathered and shows up now in in the soils. And it shows up in drinking water too. There's lots of municipalities that have to treat, for arsenic. So when I give the reference limits, they are very, very low. They are related. I don't want to bore you guys too much, but when we talk about what they do is they're called ecological risk assessors, and they do this work day in, day out, and they're looking at things like increased cancer risks and other things. And what they do is they study what they call pathways, essentially to ingestion, whether that's dermal contact, or drinking it in water, or breathing it in air, or eating it in fruits and vegetables. Those folks, that's what they do. And they generally consider one, and again, this is not my area of expertise, but I understand that one of the most conservative pathways is residential, what they call the residential pathway, and particularly where people are planting vegetables, their own gardens within, not in raised beds, within the native soils, and they are, those plants are sucking up whatever's in the, in the soil, and then the family is eating it, right? That's typically called the residential pathway. Now, I've grossly oversimplified that, but that's one pathway. Industrial pathway may be another. And to answer Mel's earlier question about the agricultural pathway, those are typically going to be higher values in general than the more conservative residential pathways. And that's why at this point, we haven't developed the framework yet to determine, but it can't be, it's not anticipated to be any more stringent than the residential pathway, if you will. So when we give the lower number of 0.11, 71, 0.3, those are considered to be extremely conservative based on state of California, which is even more rigorous than the EPA. But to answer your question, it just comes back to the fact that the state and the federal government realize that in areas of naturally occurring high metals, whether it be arsenic, cadmium, or anything else, naturally occurring lead, sometimes what they do is they establish a baseline value that is background levels, and they talk about everything in terms of additional risk over and above that which you already have from living in the area that you live in, right? So that's why I give you a range, and then at the bottom there, I do point to, for instance, number 5, little tiny bullet 5, or sorry, note 5 there. The average background value is 3.5 milligrams per kilogram in California. That might be higher in the Delta. You know, part of, no one's really obtained a lot of soil samples and really studied that. But overall in California, the background average level 3.5. I think the maximum is something, the average high end is I think 10 milligrams per kilogram in California. I'm going by memory as I remember that. So we live in California. We live in an area where the naturally occurring arsenic is higher than what the state would like to see us dealing with, right? It's true in many places in the West, and you know.
All right. Thanks, Andrew. Really great question, Jim. And that was a really great answer, Andrew, because that is a really complicated item to ensure that we're all understanding, especially if this graphic just kind of ends up in people's hands and they don't totally understand the context behind it. So thank you for calling that out, Jim, and Andrew for answering so thoroughly. Gil Cosio, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Valerie. I hadn't intended to ask a question because the chemical stuff kind of boggles my mind, but Dr. Lytle's question got me thinking, if there are chlorides, are you going to be looking at what the Regional Water Quality Control Board might think about putting some of this dirt at the toe of a levee, which is essentially into the groundwater, because the water table is right at the surface at the toe of these levees. And that's always been an issue with dredge material, that we can't contaminate the groundwater. So that's one question. You know, have you looked at that? And two, are you looking at the possibility of some of this washing off of, again, I'm thinking if we put it near a levee, washing off into the fields, farm fields, is that going to impact the ability to grow some crops? Because we don't want to have to do all that. If this ever is a stockpile for levee material, we'd rather have all that done up front in your EIR rather than us trying to do it. And the last question, you didn't present any of this data, so I assume you haven't really looked at it yet. Do you have any soil classification data for the material at depth, the tunnel depth?
Wow. All right, Gil. And I want to make sure I answer your early question. So I'm going to, you had a question 0.5, and so you asked, well, one comment you had is about notifying you about levees, levee borings. And just to be clear, Gil, yeah, we had worked with the RD on Bolden Island because the original plan was to advance a couple of soil borings within the levee prism or within the levee toe zone. Now, subsequently, in terms of budget prioritization, we've opted not to do those right now. And so otherwise we would absolutely share those with you. So the work on Bolden was really limited to some more shallow conventional soil borings to obtain samples necessary for quality samples for consolidation testing is what it is. And we're more than willing to share that information when it's available. We have identified, Gil, all of the soil boring locations that either require access through a levee, an LMA, right? Whether it's over a levee or over an island bridge, or you know, or certainly drilling within a toe or in a levee. All of those are identified, and those letters would go out, and it would be the same level of coordination that we had on Bolden would go on with that particular LMA. Now, by answering that, I slightly forgot what your questions were. One of them was about chloride. I do remember that.
Yeah, the first question was the regional board. You're going to be addressing the ability to put this at the toe of a levee if the groundwater is right at the surface, and is regional board going to be consulted in that?
Yeah, and that's absolutely, that's something that the environmental team and Carrie's team is going to be looking at is you know, what is the constituents of the material? What is the makeup of the dust during construction? What would the runoff from this material look like? You know, that kind of thing. So again, the information we have to date, which is not exhaustive, but we do have to date, suggests there's nothing in this material that would, you know, present a problem, you know, from either to ecological, to human health, to ecological, you know, resources, birds, animals. I will say that I would not be surprised, and I would hope you would not also be, that if this material came back as needing some amendments for plant sustainability. It's been down for hundreds of thousands of years, well below the delta. It probably has a very low organic material content, and therefore probably isn't, without amendments, is probably not. I'm just speculating. We have run agronomic tests on it. I have not reviewed it, but if we're talking about revegetating areas or revegetating the a tow berm, we might need to amend it, for at least the surface part of it, because I wouldn't expect it to be ready to grow grass, if you will. But yes, we are going to address all of those things. Absolutely. Absolutely.
So if I could make one comment on your response about drilling on a levee. In the first week of December, I was called out to Rec District 813, which is just east of Portland. And they were calling me to let me know that you guys are drilling on Lambert Road, so you're in the right of way, but it was on the levee. And so luckily I was able to jump in and talk to the contractor and talk to somebody at DWR that allowed me to suggest that the cement slurry backfill have bentonite added, because these areas really need some expansive your slurry. And then I was able to monitor the backfilling and it went really well, but that's a case where you didn't notify the rec district. And then I noticed in your map, there's an orange dot which indicates you've done a boring on Empire Tract, which looks really close to the levee on 8 Mile Road. And so I'd like to know how close that was to the levee. I talked to the district, no one even remembers a drill rig being out there, but it could have been during December when the farmers really aren't out a lot. So anyway, it'd be nice to maybe go back and make sure that none of those borings are going to be on or near levees. It could be a concern to a rec district.
No, and I assure you, those orange dots were not, on the levee, or we have a, we have the delta levee geometry, and we use it as a screening tool to make sure that, when we are in a, when we're in a levee per se. I think the reason there was a disconnect on the one just east of Cortland had to do with the fact that it was on the embankment itself of is that Twin Cities? No, it's not Twin Cities. Is that Lambert?
It's Lambert Road, yeah.
Yeah, Lambert Road there, yeah. And there's a very thick section of highway fill, is what I was told. But we can talk offline about that particular location. And we do have, there's bentonite is required in all of our boring backfill up to 10%, whatever the county is or the state has allowed as the maximum percentage. Because we do want it, not only do we want it to swell, we want it to be flexible. So.
Okay.
Answer your third question, Gil, because I might have forgotten that one.
Oh, the third question was, do you have any soil classification information for that material you're getting at tunnel depth?
Well, as you'd expect, it's a complete hodgepodge of everything, right? What's been interesting is we found some very thick sequences of sand kind of east of Walnut Grove. Otherwise, it's been, once you get through the deltaic soils and get into the riverbanks and the older formations, the Modestos, you get, it's I tell you, my goal was to try and connect the dots, and it's very difficult to connect the dots in the Delta because there've been so many meandering stream channels and river channels cutting their way geologically and then getting buried and overbank deposits. And so yeah, we've seen basically everything. Thick sequences of fat clay, even one or two, high plasticity silts, and some very interesting thick sand sequences kind of near Walnut Grove.
Folks, I'd like to kind of interject right here because we are running short on time and I know people have other things they need to do. So I know we could get into this in great detail and there's a lot of questions still to be answered, but I think as Andrew mentioned, this is going to be ongoing and more information will be coming out, and as Dr. Lytle suggested, there's more testing to be reported. So we're going to have to kind of cut this a little bit short. We're also thinking about we may have to cut an item off the end. Let's see how we're progressing. one of the things which I want you to think about as we're going through here, I want to make sure we don't leave out any public comments because people will want to be talking about this. But we do want to cover the community benefits program because we have the folks here today to do that. But we may have to put off the project finance until potentially March. So let's think about that. Let's see how we progress. Go ahead, Valerie.
Okay, just moving forward, and frankly, this meeting really kind of dovetailed off the last meeting, so we may not have a lot of questions or clarifications related to our December meeting, and boy, that seems like a long time ago. But in December, we did have a conversation about the Bethany alternative, specifically the complex, the traffic update, and introduction to the community benefits program. Now, we're about to have another conversation about community benefits. So I'll note that in the spirit of time. So if we could kind of clarify if we have any questions related to the last meeting, and then we can perhaps move forward and have a discussion, begin the discussion about, well, we'd have to do a quick public comment, but then move into the community benefits discussion and possibly discuss putting finance over until either a March or April meeting.
And I think if anybody has any real heavy-duty technical questions, I know we have a fair amount of expertise in this group. Maybe if you could, shelve them for a little bit and definitely bring them up again, because we do want to hear your thoughts on this, but we do have to kind of tailor this down a little bit.
And we always welcome emails, phone calls, texts, whatever it is that it takes to raise these items so that, again, they can always be addressed at another meeting or offsite. Any questions, thoughts?
Just don't forget, any questions we get will be added to the Q&A matrix and shared with everybody. So when we get a question, we make sure everyone in the SEC.
That's right.
Great. Then let's move forward on to, we're going to have public comments on this. So let's move forward to the public comments so that we don't leave those out.
Okay, I believe OSHA Meserve was the only person who submitted for public comment. OSHA, we invite you to speak. You do have 3 minutes. Feel free to take as much of that as you would like. 3 minutes. OSHA?
Yes, hello. I was a little bit shocked the way that the community concerns regarding the geotechnical drilling were discussed by Andrew. I think that it is not appropriate to, I don't even have the slides here in front of me, but I think, San Joaquin County had serious concerns about what was going on out on the roads, and when the encroachment permits were issued, there was not necessarily a full exploration of that. I think, I don't think that it's appropriate to say, oh, we had challenges and these people were ridiculous because the counties were concerned about what was going on and whether that there was the property rights necessary to conduct the drilling. And same thing with the individuals who want to make sure that they, there are subsurface rights. And, I think that there is a closer look is being taken at that issue by DWR is my understanding. And I think that's appropriate. And that's only because people raised concerns about whether it was adequate to have an encroachment permit from the county when there was also subsurface rights. So, these geotechnical sites are just a tiny microcosm of the type of disturbance that you all are proposing to bring to the Delta. So I think it's, I would expect that the DCA and DWR would be far more respectful of when people ask questions and have concerns about something so important as property rights and whether there is a right of DWR or the DCA to be on a certain property, and also whether it affects levies and things like that. I thought the attitude was terrible, and it just is indicative to me of how disrespectful this whole process has been to the local community. So I was pretty disappointed in that. Thanks.
All right, thanks so much. We do have a number of folks in the room with regard to finance, so we may want to move forward with the finance discussion instead of the community benefits discussion. Chair Palmer, how do you?
Let's do that then.
Okay.
Because the finance folks, as long as Ms. Barbieri is willing to cover this later on, then we can do the community benefits at another time.
Yeah,
Because that's probably going to create a lot of discussion, and people will want to get into it. So
we have a lot of the brain power related to this actually in the room, and that sometimes that's not easy to get.
Right, and I want when we do look at the community benefits thing, I want to make sure that everybody gets a good chance to express their thoughts on this, because this is an important thing going forward. So we will skip then. I'm sorry, I apologize, Janet Barbieri, that we're going to skip this part. So let's continue on then with the finance.
All right, we have. Who do we have? We have, hold on.
Chris Martin.
Chris Martin. Chris Martin is going to be providing this discussion, as well as the Executive Director of the Delta Finance Authority, Brian Thomas. So Chris Martin is one of the attorneys who oversees this. Chris, if you can join us.
Okay, let me see. Are you able to hear me? There we go.
Yeah, there you are. Hey, Chris.
Beautiful view of my refrigerator. As an added bonus this evening. Okay, so my understanding is there had been some interest in hearing about how the department would finance this project if a project is approved someday. And so I put together what I'll try to make a brief presentation given the time of day here to introduce folks to how the project is financed. So can we go to the next slide? I'm going to describe the kind of basic high-level concepts about how the state water project is financed. And the reason I'm going to take that approach is financing of a future Delta conveyance facility, as a practical matter, really isn't that much different than how the state water project is financed today. The department issues hundreds of millions of dollars in debt to maintain, reconstruct, and repair facilities every year. And the way we do that is essentially the same as the way a project like this one would be financed. Can we go to the next slide? Whenever I do presentations, I like to give people a sense of the relative scale of the state water project. It's something a lot of us are pretty proud of. And just point out that, this is a facility that's been in the state operating for about 60 years now, and serves, it's often said that it serves Southern California, but in point of fact, we probably all on this meeting have friends and family, or maybe ourselves, are receiving water supply from this project. And it's responsible for a lot of what we consider being kind of stereotypical California, whether you're talking ag in the Central Valley or beautiful neighborhoods along the coast. And this just shows that, we're serving the San Francisco Bay Area all the way down to the southern reaches of the state. And getting that done requires a lot of money. And the folks who established the State Water Project back in the late 50s and early 60s really did a remarkable job in setting up the framework that we use and that I'm going to explain to you at a very high level today. It's actually fairly complicated. Next slide, please. So the way the State Water Project is paid for, we divide costs of our project into two different categories. There's operations and maintenance, which are paid on a pay-as-you-go basis, if you will, and there are capital costs. And we only actually finance capital costs. And when I say we finance capital costs, I mean we issue debt, like bonds or commercial paper or other forms of indebtedness to borrow money that we use to pay for capital costs, so for large assets. The Central Valley Project Act, which is one of two acts that provides the rules of the road, if you will, for how the department finances things, allows the department to issue bonds to fund both facility construction and actually planning costs. So that's actually helpful in a situation like this where planning costs are envisioned to be pretty large. We'll get into how bonds work. My brief introduction to who's on the SEC, just by virtue of watching the presentation today, it sounds like we've got people from all different walks of life. So I want to talk a little bit about how bonds work. So bonds, as I said, are a form of indebtedness. It's like a loan. People purchase bonds from the department via investment banks or other brokers. And in exchange, the department agrees to repay that loan using revenue from the state water project. And we repay it with interest. If we go to the next slide. So investors purchase our bonds and we take the proceeds of those bonds and we use that money to build things. In return, as I said, the department promises to repay those bondholders using state water project revenue. And that's a really important thing to understand about the state water project. And I think it's probably not well understood in many parts of the state because this just isn't a subject that gets spoken about much. But state water project revenues, they're actually not an obligation of the state of California. And when I say they're not an obligation, what I mean by that is the state of California is not on the hook to repay those bonds. So this is distinct from, I think, what most people are familiar with, which are called general obligation bonds. And those are bonds that are backed by the full faith and credit of the state of California, which means that a general bond would be repaid using tax revenue that the state collects. So that's it's a big contrast. It's something that's not always well understood. So at any rate, that's an important distinction. Let's go to the next slide. So this is actually something that's important when our bonds, like state general obligation bonds, are issued a credit rating. We have a credit score, essentially, just like somebody would in their own personal financial life. And the people that buy our bonds, it's important that they understand where the money to repay them will come from. And so I just put up on the screen here for you, this is one of the, you call it the fine print, but as somebody has pointed out, it's actually not fine print. And in our investor disclosure documents, it appears in all caps, in bold, to make sure people are aware of this. But the bonds issued by the department are limited obligations of the Department of Water Resources. They are not an obligation of the state of California. So neither the taxing power of the state, or the credit of the state, nor the good faith of the state is pledged to the repayment of the bonds. Let's go to the next slide, please. So that might raise the question in people's minds, okay, well, where does the money come from? Because somebody's paying this debt. And that's true. And so what I'd like to do is give folks an idea of what I mean when I say SWP revenue. The Department of Water Resources, in a way, sits in the position of a wholesaler, right? We are not customer facing in the sense that the state water project does not send a bill to individual families and businesses in the state of California if they get water from the project. We supply water and other related services to other public agencies. And it's the responsibility of those other public agencies to then raise revenue to pay the bill that they get from us. And so when those local public agencies raise revenue, and they then use some of that revenue to pay their state water project bill, and also to pay for any other water supply sources they have. That money that we receive from the public water agencies in payment for their bill is what we refer to as SWP revenue. And that revenue is described and governed in the contracts that the department has with the public water agencies that are parties to long-term water supply contracts with us. So each of those 29 public agencies has a contract with the department, and they agree to pay fixed costs like financing costs. And by fixed costs, I mean they're costs that don't vary every year depending on how much water is supplied. They're always the same. And also to pay variable costs, which are the costs of things like the electrical power that's used to move water, which obviously would vary depending on how much water there is. They pay us those costs, and they also pay for other services provided by the department. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the next question you might be asking, and the next thing I want to explain is, okay, well, you've told me that DWR gets its revenue from the public water agencies that participate in the State Water Project. Well, where do they get their money? And the answer is those public water agencies get the money from their customers and people within their service areas. And the way they do that is through one of two processes. They either charge, I should say one or both. They may charge water rates. And we usually think of water rates as being an amount of money you pay per unit of water supplied to you. And another way that some of those agencies raise money to pay their State Water Project bill is through local property taxes that are become part of the tax bill you might receive from your county that you live in. Of our 29 different contractors, I would venture to guess that the exact ratio of how much of their bill is paid with water rates and how much of their money do they raise in property taxes, it's probably different for almost every one of those 29 contractors. But that's something that each agency addresses at a local level. Can we go to the next slide? So that brings us to the Delta Conveyance Facility. So, how would the Delta Conveyance Facility be financed if a project is approved? And the answer to that is that the Department of Water Resources would issue revenue bonds to raise capital for construction of the facility. I say revenue bonds because that word revenue refers to the fact that we're using State Water Project revenue to repay the bonds. The environmental review, so for instance, development of an EIR, the planning, much of what's going on here, the design costs, all of those things are also may be financed through the issuance of revenue bonds. It is within the scope of the department's ability to finance those types of costs in the development of a capital asset like a Delta Conveyance project. If the department were to issue revenue bonds, the flip side of that then is somebody has to pay for those. And so this would occur in the same manner it always does with the State Water Project. The department would issue bonds. The debt service on those bonds would be incorporated into the bills that get sent to the public water agencies. And then those public water agencies would pay those bills according to the terms of their water supply contract with the Department of Water Resources. The next slide. So this slide, this is a little bit different. This isn't strictly speaking how the project is financed, but it's sort of an interesting tidbit about the world of finance. Before the department would issue revenue bonds for the Delta Conveyance project, the department is asking a court to confirm its authority to issue bonds in a special kind of lawsuit called a validation case. And validation cases are kind of an unusual thing because typically, and this is probably obvious to people if you think about it, courts won't typically let you come in and ask an opinion of them in the absence of some sort of dispute, so an argument between parties. Validation cases are different because you're essentially asking the court for an advisory opinion. And you're asking, before anybody challenges this court, is this something we have the capacity or authority to do? The reason we're doing this is somewhat unique to the financing world, though not entirely. Validation cases can be brought up in contractual contexts as well. But it's very important to purchasers of debt to know that the entity that they're purchasing the debt from, whether that's a government entity like DWR or a private entity like a corporation, they're very concerned about having certainty with respect to the authority of that issuer to issue the debt, because they don't want to find out someday that they're holding debt that's of no value, that was issued in the absence of authority. I mean, that's obviously of concern to an investor. So a lawsuit like this validation case is a way for the department to demonstrate that the authority has been carefully examined and determined by a court. And that decision is final, which means that once that decision has been taken, other folks can't come in and question the authority or question the validity of that debt. So it makes the folks that own the debt comfortable that they've made a sound investment. Let's see, next slide, please. Oh, okay, and there we are. We have, I think, 9 minutes left for questions. So I know I went through those slides relatively quickly. So I'm more than happy to answer some questions if folks have them. If not, maybe we go to comment. So I'll just hush up there for a minute and wait and see.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate it. Thank you so much. We do have some hands up. We're going to start with Anna Swenson.
Okay.
And just a reminder, by the way, the reason we're having this conversation is because this is an issue that was raised by the SEC as an information item that a point of information that folks wanted to have. So this was an issue that is on the Q&A matrix, and that's why we're here. So Anna.
Thank you. Thank you for that presentation. So a couple of things. One of the things that I always look at when I hear about the financing with DWR is, although much better job today, so congratulations, but there's a lot of hand waving about who pays for what. And in the end, the taxpayer, the ratepayer are on the hook. And that is regardless of whether you benefit from the project or not, you're on the hook. And the other thing is that I find it highly irresponsible for a state agency like DWR to amass this level of debt with so much uncertainty in the world, because what you're doing is you're saddling my kids with those debts and Douglas's grandchildren and any other kids that are in the state of California right now. They're going to be the ones that are going to carry this. And I take that very seriously, because this project to me doesn't seem like something that is a for sure. And if I'm going to spend their money, which is more expensive than the cost of the money today, I think that we have to be extra diligent to make sure that we are being conscientious and wise. And DWR has a habit of being a little bit flippant about spending money that they're not responsible for. And then I know I always get shut down for this, but I'm going to say it. The work has to be done on the aqueduct. It is losing 30% of the water that flows down it due to evaporation every single day. And I have a really hard time justifying spending this Cadillac top to a jalopy Pinto base when we know that the aqueduct is the thing that we're all going to have to rely on. It's not seismically sound, it's leaking, it's subsiding, and above all, it is not good stewards of the water of California, which is a public trust. We are not being good stewards when we know every single day water flows down that aqueduct and we're losing 30% to evaporation. It's nature. And so I really want to encourage DWR to figure that out, to figure out what the cost of that is. And in my personal opinion, until we figure out what that repair cost and upgrade of the California aqueduct is, I don't think we have any sense or mind to be attempting to spend this kind of money on something that relies on a part that is defect. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for that comment. I'd like to respond to one part of that, if I may. And that is that I understand that the magnitude of the costs appears to be very large. What I will say about that, though, is that it is not the case that the department is imposing these costs on residents of the state of California. The decision to participate in this project and the decision to spend money on a project like this and to consider whether this project makes sense in terms of cost in comparison to other available water supply options. It's an important question, and it's a question that the public boards of public water agencies consider on a regular basis. They carefully consider whether these costs are appropriate for their agency and service area. And they take all kinds of factors into consideration, including like I said, the relative cost of this water supply as opposed to other options. And that's all I'll say on that point. On the point about saddling children with costs of the project, look, I've got 3 kids, and I don't want somebody saddling them with exorbitant costs. But what I would say about that is, first of all, I don't know if we're saddling your kids per se, because I don't know if you receive water supply from the State Water Project. But one of the things I'd like people to take home from this conversation is that it's not the state taxpayers generally that pay for this project or the existing state water project. It is people who receive water from the project that pay for this project. And if there's one point I can emphasize, it's that one. And I think that's really important to think about, because those same people have a connection through public representatives to the water agencies that they receive their water supply from. So they have a voice there.
This goes back to my question earlier when we were looking at the board for the DCA. And the problem is there's a lack of stakeholders. There's a lack of public understanding as to what these decisions are, how much this is going to cost. And as far as agencies getting their free reign choice to join or not, I know that there has been pressure on them. There has been threats of taking away their current contracts if they don't sign on. And we could argue the semantics of that back and forth, but I really don't agree with you that this is such a free will. You know, this is more like a bad choice that's being shoved onto these communities and these ratepayers. And I'm not necessarily convinced that they have a full understanding. We've already talked in this meeting about the lack of equity to disadvantaged communities. A lot of disadvantaged communities are going to pay for this project, and they have absolutely no idea we are meeting at this moment. And so until you can prove that those boards are going out and are doing their due diligence and are making sure that their ratepayers have a very crystal clear understanding of what this project will cost them from now and into the future, I don't think that you can actually say that. And so I'm going to respectfully disagree with you, but thank you for your information. And please look into the aqueduct because it's a big issue.
Fair enough.
Thanks, Anna. Okay, Barbara, very good. Priya.
Okay, so I have a couple comments and a couple questions and observations, kind of a different track. Some of my more conservative friends in the Delta will kill me. Debt, as a rule of thumb, doesn't scare me because nothing really gets built in this world without debt. But there is something to say for responsible debt. Look, we have right now $1 billion in outstanding debt in water districts in California, with 350,000 water users who are poised to have their water services shut off because of COVID. One question for me is, how many of those districts are actually part of the state water project? Second question, you have what, 28 million people served by the state water project. So by X amount of millions of water users, they're going to be hit with a combination of those parcel taxes and higher water rates. Water affordability in San Diego and Los Angeles is already a problem. You know, there was a lot of work by MWD that it would be the cost of a latte. But when I was down there, I found that a lot of people couldn't afford the extra latte. Water debt, according to Manny Teodoro, who is an expert on water affordability in the United States, is really supposed to be an 8-hour workday at minimum wage for what your water bill is supposed to be per month. And we're exceeding that throughout the state water project. MWD, during the last iteration, went to water districts and said, if you don't want to be part of the project, you can opt out. You won't get the water. So then you're actually putting in more debt on the districts that are going to opt in. That is going to cause inequities. But then at MWD, we had a little bit of the same problem at Santa Clara Valley. We've seen this shuffling of what can be paid for parcel taxes versus water rates. And then you end up with a scenario where people are paying for water development of projects through parcel taxes for water they're not going to receive. That's why the validation suits are so problematic for us, because if water districts do go belly up, it is the state of California that is ultimately then responsible for that debt.
Actually, Barbara, I'd like to stop you right there, because that's just not true. The bonds issued by the department are issued according to a resolution adopted by the department that constitutes a contract between the department and the holders of the bonds.
Right.
They have no recourse to the state of California.
Yeah, but what happens when a water district goes belly up? Because what we're fearful
That's a different question.
Well, that's what I'm getting at, because
And we'd have to talk about the specific water district in question. And as you've mentioned, there are many in the state.
That's right. But it is a problem for this project because you have water districts that are already in the state water project under financial duress. So, you know, our fear is that you're taking on more debt within districts that aren't going to be able to handle it. And when water districts do fail, it does incur costs for the state.
Well, I guess what I would, the point I would reiterate there is only that that's why it's important that these local water boards are considering the cost issue. You know, they know their service area better than I do. My job is to help organize the financing. It's up to the local agencies to determine what is appropriate for them.
You know what? You're right. You are right about that. It's not necessarily the DCA's function. It's not necessarily DWR's function. But the reason why this is probably, poor Chris, probably the presentation that is irritating me the most in the year of doing work.
Yeah, it's not fair. I just got my hair cut and everything for this.
Sorry about that. But the reason why it is the most irritating for me is that if we are looking at 50% reduced flows according to the climate vulnerability assessment, you're going to have less and less water. You're going to have fixed debt that has to be paid. And that's all I can say is the whole question of water affordability, how we're going to come out of COVID, if these districts are solvent to pay for it long time, that's the big issue. Are you really going to get?
I think that's it's fair and reasonable to be concerned about that. And yes, anecdotally, all I can tell you about that is that having worked with our water contractors for a decade now, I can tell you they are very concerned about costs and cost control. Very concerned. And while when we throw around numbers like 14 billion and 15 billion, that those two things may not sound like they go together, they do. And they are looking at the host of possible options to continue to provide good service to their residents and reliable service. And so, you know, I can't tell you what the right answer is, but I can tell you that in my experience, our contractors tend to be very cost conscious.
So here's my last comment about that, and I know other people want to talk, and we're getting late. My great fear, because of the costs and because our water districts are not in sound financial shape going into this, is then where is the cost cutting going to come? Is it going to come in the form of what really needs to be done for good mitigation? That is kind of the second part. It's the debt for families that can't afford it. And then it's where does the cost cutting come? It comes for the Delta community. So
Barbara,
I'll leave it there.
If you could cut that short, because we are basically out of time now completely. And this is a huge discussion. It's a good philosophical discussion and a good factual discussion. But we're going to have to move on and maybe come back to that. And thank you so much, Chris, for addressing this. And Barbara, your thoughts are extremely important. But I'm going to have to cut this.
Thanks for inviting me. I appreciate it.
We do need to find out if we've got any other committee members who have the comments. And would I please, at this point, I'm going to do a little bit of a president's prerogative and say, hey, you're going to have 2 minutes. That's it.
And again, the goal is this is an information item with the understanding that this is how this is moving forward and the philosophy behind it. It really, you know, this isn't the place where the decision about the go, no go is happening. You know, we have some of the experts in the room who are talking about how and why this is, you know, how
agencies are going to have to make up their own minds. So let's continue. Do we have any other board members who need to say something and you feel you really must?
Exactly. We have Douglas, Jim, and Mike Moran. Douglas?
Yes, Chris. Okay. I'm envisioning the balance sheet. So apparently on the right-hand side, you have the liability. That's where you issue the bonds. So is that equity on the balance sheet?
Chris, you are muted. There you go.
Sorry. What's the question? I'm sorry.
Sorry. Okay. I'm envisioning the balance sheet.
The balance.
On the right-hand side, you have the liability, and that's where the bonds are issued. And is there any equity in the bottom of the balance sheet?
Is there
I
an
don't think
equity
the
at the bottom of the
traditional
balance
balance sheet is the way to look at how the State Water Project is financed. Certainly, the water project has assets, and those assets have value.
Now, assets is on the left-hand side, but then you have a liability and capital, right? So my question is—
For a corporate balance sheet, that's true. It's beyond the scope of this discussion, though, to get into the department's financial statements.
Let's continue on, because as we said, this is just an informational item. It's not something that we're debating. So if anybody has a question to understand, I think we have 2 more people, and that's it. Please be short.
Yep, Jim Cox.
Sorry,
Okay, I just want a little clarification on something here. You've described this like it all happens. Now, what happens if it doesn't happen? That for some reason this project gets stopped. So the people that have bought these bonds are going to get paid back by the water users. But if there's no project, there's no water users. So how are the water users still stuck for this? I'm trying to understand. You know, you make it sound like nobody's going to be on the line here, but it sounds to me like they are.
So I apologize if I gave you the impression that nobody's going to be on the hook. I think your question is if a project is partially constructed
No, if it never happens at all.
Project is constructed.
Well, the department hasn't issued any debt to fund this project. So it's not being paid. You know, we're not.
Okay,
we're not
okay, well, now you've really lost me here because you just said you have this court case going to prove that you can issue the bonds. And so if you haven't issued bonds yet, okay, but you intend to. And
if a project is approved.
The project has to be approved first, Jim.
Okay, thank you. That answers the question then. Thank you.
So let's move on. One last question, please.
Moran.
I don't think that's the answer.
Hey, Chris, thanks very much. It's a great presentation. What's the interplay of this, the bonds and expenditures on Davis-Dahlwig and on the community benefits plan? Is there any interplay between these things?
Davis-Dahlwig could be the subject of another 3-hour conversation.
Okay.
Well beyond the scope of this. All I'll say about that is it addresses an issue related to who pays for enhancement of fish and wildlife, and that really goes back into some philosophical notions that were, state policy, if you will, and debates that were had back in the 60s when they built the project.
Let's not get into that.
I won't.
Okay.
And the other question about community benefits is I don't know because I'm not familiar with what's being discussed for the community benefits program right now.
Okay.
We'll get into that later. Is that it for our?
And it's this will likely be an ongoing information item at different points. But again, Chris, thank you for coming. Again, you have all of this information, but you can, I think, rest assured we're going to be tapping you in the future for a little more. A little more information.
As either a threat or a promise.
All right.
Okay, so how about public comment now?
We have no one with information in for or the comment card in for public comment on item 6.
Okay, then what we're going to do is we're going to be looking forward now on things. Obviously, I apologize for rushing everybody through. I know a lot of people have other meetings and things to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to identify April 28th as our next meeting date. And at that point, we're going to basically look at the DWR CEQA. And let's see, I just made a note of this. We'll be looking at the DWR CEQA, the Environmental Justice Survey results, and then we'll come on back to the Community Benefits Program. Now, at that point, we've got a couple months then, so this is your committee. What I'd like you guys to do is kind of your homework assignment here. Make sure that you think about how you've got what you're going to do in terms of what issues or topics do you want to hear about in the future, because obviously we've got most of the main engineering work under our belts, but things are going to become, as you can see, we've got further studies going on. There will be other engineering issues that will come up from time to time, but think about what kind of questions we can dig deeper on, and do we need to start to think about subcommittees to address specific issues? So think about that. And we want to invite you to help us develop the agendas and the work effort. So please be ready to, you can email Valerie or Catherine or Nasli, and we can develop some of these thoughts. So we can hear from you about what our path is moving forward. We will be slowing down the pace a little bit as we're not going to meet in March. We will meet in April. We'll at that point continue on with the agenda items we didn't do. Now, in terms of item number 8, non-agendized SEC questions or comments, anything that you have which is non-agendized and relevant to these issues?
We do have a hand up, David Glasky.
Yes, thank you. I promise to take just a minute here, and appreciate the notice that it would be great to get some SEC input on the agendas. I made the comment last meeting, and it would be great to get on sometime before 6:15 to talk about things that are important to us. So I think 20 or 30 minutes with allocated to things that the members here think are important would be great. from my point of view, you've all heard the two issues that I'm campaigning for or an advocate for, and that is the complete redundancy on any new pump that goes in to be redundant with banks, and also the ability of the project to be able to deliver fresh water to the South Delta to improve quality and help with emergency response. And I just wanted to point out that Catherine and Carrie were really good to hook me up with some people that were really bright in these areas. And we had a number of meetings. It was, I've talked with the Stewardship Council, the Protection Commission, people at DWR and Emergency Response, the CVP, the Byron Irrigation District, Contra Costa Water, Contra Costa Supervisors. And, you know, all of it kind of leads me to still be strong in the convictions for these two capabilities. So I think it's something that still should be talked about. I also discovered through the help of some other colleagues that the original peripheral canal project of the 70s actually had 6,000 cubic feet per second allocated towards refreshing the Delta with words saying to help with Delta water quality due to the reverse flows that the pumps were creating. And this was back in the 70s. So clearly people back then saw the ability for this type of a project to deliver water to freshen. And certainly they were moving a lot more water with that canal. So 6,000 cubic feet is something they were allocating to just deliver back at different points because they were crossing the canal to different points in the Delta. And I think it's important to continue the discussion about how this project can deliver some of those same benefits if it were to be undertaken. So that's where I want to go with that. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. Any other thoughts? Again, you know, this is one of those items that, as Chair Palmer said, you can email, text, put in phone calls. I know that we do occasionally get emails and texts from folks, and we usually circle back and have those conversations. And you've heard, just like David was talking about, the fact that Catherine and Carrie set up meetings. So, you know, this isn't that moment where, you know, say it now or forever hold your peace. Obviously, this is an ongoing discussion. And obviously, the goal is to keep the discussion within the realm of DCA, right? You know, there's some information items, of course, that we can have discussion on, but at the end of the day, the goal is to keep things within the realm of the work. And if the information informs the work, that works as well.
Good.
I think
so
we're done.
Do we have any more from the SEC? Now then we should get on to public comment for non-agendized items. Do we have any public comment for non-agendized items?
We do. We have OSHA Meserve who would like to make a comment. OSHA, once again, you have 3 minutes and you can use as much of that as you'd like.
That's all right, folks. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night, OSHA. Thank you for joining us.
Big hugs, girl. Thank you.
Thank
That
you.
was a record for OSHA. 1 second.
Thank you, OSHA. Okay, so there we go. So again, next meeting, April 28th. Do your homework, contact your people, and make sure you think about where we're going and what you would like to bring up. Other than that, I'm adjourning the meeting, and thank you so much for your time.